Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through the most sacred mystery of Hyrule's realm. Tonight, we'll explore the complete history of the Triforce, that golden relic of immeasurable power that has shaped destiny across countless ages. From its divine origins in the hands of the golden goddesses to its hidden presence in the most recent legends, this is a story of wisdom, power, and courage that flows like gentle streams through time itself. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift as we trace the golden threads of destiny that bind all things together. Close your eyes when ready, and let's begin our peaceful journey. In the beginning, there was nothing but the endless void of non-existence, a darkness so complete and profound that even the concept of emptiness had yet to be born. This was not merely the absence of light or matter, but something far more fundamental, the complete negation of being itself, where neither time nor space held meaning because there was nothing to give them definition. Into this primordial nothingness came three divine beings whose very presence would reshape the nature of reality itself. These were the golden goddesses, entities of such immense power and wisdom that their arrival marked the first moment when existence began to stir from its eternal slumber. They came not as conquerors but as creators, bearing within themselves the fundamental forces that would give birth to everything that would ever be. Din arrived first, her presence like a great flame that burns, not with destruction but with the fierce joy of creation itself. She was the embodiment of power in its purest form, not the crude strength that seeks to dominate and destroy, but the primal force that builds mountains from nothing and sets the very foundations of worlds. Her essence was fire and earth, the raw materials from which physical reality could be shaped. With arms that blazed like the heart of a star, Din began the work of creation by forging the physical realm itself. She reached into the void with hands that could grasp concepts as easily as clay, and from the nothingness she pulled forth matter and energy in their countless forms. Stone and metal, fire and lightning. The very building blocks of existence flowed from her touch like water from a spring. The land she created was not the gentle, rolling hills that would one day be called Hyrule, but something far more primal and magnificent. Mountain ranges that stretched beyond all horizons, thrust upward from primordial plains, their peaks reaching toward a sky that had not yet been separated from the earth below. Vast continents shifted and settled as Din's power flowed through them, creating the geological foundations upon which all future civilizations would build their hopes and dreams. Rivers of molten rock flowed like golden blood through valleys that had never known the touch of rain, while crystals of impossible beauty formed in caverns so deep that their depths would remain unexplored for countless eons. The very elements themselves danced to Din's will, fire and earth joining in a cosmic ballet that set the fundamental patterns of physical law. Yet for all its raw majesty, this newborn world was a realm of chaos, where the forces Din had unleashed moved according to no pattern save their own wild nature. Mountains crumbled as quickly as they rose, seas boiled away into nothing only to be replaced by others, and the primal energies that flowed through everything were as likely to destroy as to create. Into this magnificent chaos came the second goddess, Nehru, whose nature was as different from Din's as twilight is from dawn, yet equally essential to the work of creation. Where Din was fire and passion, Nehru was cool wisdom and perfect understanding. She looked upon the wild realm that Din had brought forth and saw not disorder but potential, not chaos but a symphony waiting for a conductor to give it meaning. Nehru's gift to creation was the establishment of order itself. The divine laws, that would govern how all things interacted with one another, from the greatest galaxy to the smallest grain of sand. She breathed upon Din's raw creation, and wherever her breath touched, the wild chaos settled into patterns of mathematical beauty that would endure until the end of time itself. Under Nehru's influence, the random shifting of continents settled into stable geological processes that would shape the land according to comprehensible principles. The wild energies that had crackled through the atmosphere organized themselves into weather patterns that followed predictable cycles, while the very elements learned to obey laws that made complex chemistry possible. She established the flow of time as a river that moves always forward, never backward, giving sequence and meaning to events that would otherwise exist in eternal simultaneity. She created the dimensions of space, the up and down and left and right, that would allow creatures to navigate through the reality that was taking shape around them. Most importantly, Nehru established the principle of cause and effect, the fundamental law that would govern all interactions between the myriad forms of existence that were yet to come. Every action would have consequences, every choice would ripple outward through the web of reality, and every being would be responsible for the changes they brought to the world around them. Yet even with Din's raw power and Nehru's organizing wisdom, the newborn universe remained empty of the one element that would give it true meaning. The mountains and seas, the orderly cycles of time and space, the elegant mathematical relationships that governed the dance of matter and energy, all of these were merely the stage upon which the real drama of existence was meant to unfold. This final gift came from Farore, the third goddess, whose essence was neither the blazing power of Din nor the cool wisdom of Nehru, but something more elusive, yet equally fundamental. Farore was courage itself, the divine spark that dares to act even when the outcome cannot be known, the force that chooses hope over despair and life over emptiness. With breath that carried the essence of possibility itself, Farore began the most delicate and miraculous work of all creation. Into the ordered physical realm that her sisters had prepared, she breathed life in all its countless forms, from the greatest dragons that would one day soar through ancient skies, to the smallest flowers that would bloom in hidden meadows where no eyes would ever see them. The life that flowed from Farore's breath was not merely biological existence, but something far more profound and mysterious. She gave the gift of consciousness, the ability to perceive and wonder and dream, to creatures who would use these abilities to reshape the world around them in ways that even the goddesses could not foresee. She created the capacity for growth and change, the drive that would push living beings to become more than they were, to reach beyond their limitations and aspire to greatness that their origins could never have predicted. Through her gift, simple organisms would develop into complex societies. Individual creatures would learn to work together toward common goals, and eventually, some forms of life would even begin to understand their own place in the cosmic order. Most mysteriously of all, Farore breathed into her creation the concept of free will, the ability to choose between different paths, even when those choices carried consequences that could not be undone. This was perhaps the most dangerous gift the goddesses could have given to their creation, for it meant that the ordered reality Nehru had established could be disrupted by the choices of countless individual beings, each following their own understanding of what was right and good. With this final act of creation, the work of the three goddesses was complete. They had brought into existence a universe that was simultaneously ordered and chaotic, predictable and surprising, beautiful and dangerous. It was a reality where matter and energy danced according to immutable laws, yet where conscious beings could use their understanding of those laws to achieve things that seemed to border on the miraculous. Yet, as the goddesses prepared to depart from the reality they had created, they understood that their work, magnificent as it was, remained incomplete in one crucial respect. They had created a universe capable of supporting countless forms of life and consciousness, but they had also made that consciousness free to choose between wisdom and folly, between harmony and conflict, between creation and destruction. The gift of free will that had made their creation truly alive also made it potentially unstable. Beings blessed with consciousness and power might choose to use those gifts in ways that could damage or even destroy the delicate balance that made existence possible. The very freedom that made life meaningful also made it fragile. The goddesses needed some way to ensure that their creation would endure, even if those who inherited it made choices that threatened its continued existence. They needed a safeguard, a source of power that could restore balance when it was lost, heal damage when it was done, and offer hope when all seemed lost to darkness and despair. From their own divine essence, the three goddesses crafted a relic that would embody all their gifts in perfect harmony. This was the Triforce, a manifestation of divine power that combined Din's strength, Nehru's wisdom, and Pharaoh's courage into a single artifact of unimaginable potential. The Triforce was more than simply a powerful magical item, though it was certainly that. It was a physical embodiment of the fundamental forces that had created and now sustained all existence. Within its golden triangular form was contained the very essence of creation itself, the power that had brought order from chaos and life from emptiness. Each of the three triangular sections that made up the complete Triforce represented one of the goddesses and the virtue they had brought to creation. The Triforce of power carried within it the creative force that Din had used to forge the physical world, the strength that could reshape reality according to the will of whoever possessed it. Yet this was not crude, destructive force, but the fundamental energy that made all change and growth possible. The Triforce of wisdom contained the organizing principle that Nehru had used to establish the laws that governed reality. Whoever possessed this piece would have access to understanding that transcended normal mortal comprehension, the ability to perceive the deeper patterns that connected all things, and to use that knowledge to achieve goals that seemed impossible to others. The Triforce of courage embodied the divine spark that Pharaoh had breathed into all living things, the willingness to act even in the face of uncertainty and danger. This piece would grant its bearer not just physical bravery, but something far more profound, the moral courage to make difficult choices and accept responsibility for their consequences, even when the outcome could not be guaranteed. Together, the three pieces formed a perfect unity that could grant any wish to whoever possessed them all, but only if that person had achieved a perfect balance of power, wisdom, and courage within themselves. This requirement was not arbitrary, but reflected the fundamental nature of reality itself. Creation had required all three divine virtues working in harmony, and anyone who sought to wield the full power of creation would need to embody that same harmony. The Triforce was designed to be beyond the reach of the goddesses themselves, for they understood that their creation needed the freedom to grow and develop without constant divine intervention. They could not use their own creation to reshape it according to their will, for that would negate the gift of free will they had given to the conscious beings who would inherit this reality. As the three golden goddesses prepared to depart from the physical realm they had created, they needed to choose a resting place for the Triforce, somewhere it would be safe from those who might misuse its power, while remaining accessible to those who might genuinely need its help. They created a special dimension adjacent to the physical world, a realm that would come to be known as the sacred realm. This dimension existed in a state of perfect harmony, where the natural forces that the goddesses had set in motion operated according to their purest intentions. It was a place where power, wisdom, and courage were perfectly balanced. where the physical laws were stable and predictable, and where the essence of creation itself remained untainted by the conflicts and contradictions that would inevitably arise in the world of mortal beings. The sacred realm was not empty, but contained wonders that reflected the best of what creation could achieve. Crystal formations of impossible beauty grew in patterns that followed mathematical principles of perfect elegance, while rivers of the purest water flowed through landscapes that seemed designed by a master artist whose medium was reality itself. Here the Triforce would rest, waiting for the day when it might be needed to restore balance to a world that had been thrown into chaos by the choices of those who inherited it. The goddesses did not know when or how this might happen, for they had deliberately made the future unpredictable by granting free will to their creation. They only knew that eventually, someone would need the power to heal what had been broken and restore what had been lost. With the Triforce safely placed in its sacred resting place, the golden goddesses departed from the physical realm, their work complete. They left behind no instructions, no commandments, no detailed prophecies about how their gift should be used. Instead, they entrusted their creation to the wisdom and courage of those who would inherit it, confident that the fundamental goodness they had woven into the very fabric of reality would ultimately prevail over any darkness that might arise. The departure of the goddesses marked the end of the age of creation and the beginning of the age of inheritance. The universe they had brought into being would now develop according to the choices made by countless generations of conscious beings, each contributing their own understanding of what it meant to use power wisely and courageously. Yet, even in their absence, the influence of the three goddesses remained woven into every aspect of the reality they had created. The physical laws that governed the behavior of matter and energy were expressions of their divine will. The capacity for growth and learning that made evolution and progress possible was their gift to every living thing. The moral sense that allowed conscious beings to distinguish between right and wrong was their guidance built into the very structure of existence itself. The Triforce remained in the sacred realm, glowing with golden light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of existence itself. It was waiting, patient, as only divine artifacts can be patient, for the time when its power would be needed to fulfill the deepest purposes for which it had been created. In ages to come, heroes and villains would seek it out, some driven by noble intentions and others by selfish desires, but none could claim it without proving themselves worthy of the tremendous responsibility it represented. Thus began the eternal dance between divine gift and mortal choice that would define all the ages to come, as the children of the goddesses learned to live with the freedom their creators had given them while the Triforce waited in its sacred sanctuary, ready to offer hope and power to those who proved themselves worthy of both. In the ages that followed the departure of the golden goddesses, when the echoes of creation still rang through the crystalline halls of the sacred realm and the Triforce pulsed with golden light in its sanctuary, the surface world began to flourish with life beyond imagining. Yet even as countless species spread across the vast continents and learned to make their homes in every conceivable environment, dark forces stirred in the deepest places of the earth, ancient malevolence that had somehow survived the purifying light of divine creation. These were not the chaotic remnants of the primordial void that the goddesses had banished, but something far more insidious and dangerous. In the spaces between dimensions, in the cracks and shadows where divine light could not easily penetrate, entities of pure malice had taken root and grown strong. They were beings that fed on suffering and despair, creatures whose very existence was an affront to the harmony and balance that the goddesses had woven into the fabric of reality. The greatest and most terrible of these dark entities bore the name Demise, though in the earliest ages he was known by other titles that have been lost to the mists of time. He was hatred given form, destruction made manifest, the very antithesis of everything the golden goddesses had sought to create. Where they had brought order from chaos, he sought to return all things to the void. Where they had breathed life into emptiness, he hungered to drain that life away and leave only death in its wake. Demise was not merely a powerful demon, but something far more fundamental and terrifying. He was the personification of entropy itself, the force that seeks to tear down every structure, corrupt every pure thing, and ultimately return the universe to the state of non-existence from which the goddesses had called it forth. His very presence was a wound in reality, a place where the natural laws that governed creation began to break down and give way to chaos and despair. For countless eons, Demise had dwelt in the darkness between worlds, gathering strength and plotting his assault upon the surface realm. He understood that the key to unmaking creation lay not in brute force alone, though he possessed power enough to shake the foundations of continents, but in claiming the source of creative power itself. If he could seize the Triforce, he could use the goddess's own gift to undo everything they had accomplished. The Demon King's hunger for the sacred relic was not born of any noble desire to better the world or protect those he cared about. His was a purely destructive appetite, the need to corrupt and consume that drives all entities of pure malice. He coveted the Triforce not for what it could build, but for what it could destroy, not for the harmony it could restore, but for the chaos it could unleash if wielded by one whose heart knew only hatred. Yet Demise faced a seemingly insurmountable obstacle in his quest to claim divine power. The sacred realm where the Triforce rested was protected by barriers that had been woven from the very essence of creation itself, defenses that were designed to keep out all those whose hearts were not pure. The goddesses had foreseen that their gift might be coveted by those who would misuse it, and they had taken precautions to ensure that the sacred relic would remain beyond the reach of those driven by selfish desire. But if Demise could not reach the Triforce directly, he could still pursue his destructive goals through other means. The surface world teemed with life forms that had been blessed by the goddess's creative power, and by corrupting or destroying them, he could strike at the very heart of what the divine beings had sought to accomplish. If he could not unmake creation by claiming its source, he would do so by destroying its children one by one. The Demon King began to gather about himself an army of creatures as twisted and malevolent as he was himself. These were beings that had been born from the intersection of darkness and corrupted life force, monsters whose very existence was an offense against the natural order. Some were spirits of pure malice that had somehow achieved physical form, while others were once noble creatures that had been so thoroughly corrupted by exposure to dark power that nothing of their original nature remained. This host of nightmares included creatures that would become the ancestors of many of the monsters that would plague future ages. The Bokoblins, with their crude weapons and savage intelligence, served as the foot soldiers of Demise's army. The Moblins, larger and more brutal than their smaller cousins, acted as commanders and enforcers. Most terrible of all were the Lizalfos, reptilian warriors whose cunning and cruelty made them ideal instruments of the Demon King's will. As Demise's forces gathered strength in the deep places of the earth, preparing for their assault upon the surface world, they did not go entirely unnoticed. There were those among the mortals who possessed the sensitivity to perceive the growing darkness, individuals whose connection to the divine essence that flowed through all living things allowed them to sense the approaching storm. Among these was a being whose nature transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine, a goddess who had chosen to remain in the physical realm rather than departing with her sisters to whatever distant paradise they had claimed for themselves. Hylia, as she came to be known, was not one of the three golden goddesses who had created reality itself, but she was divine nonetheless, blessed with power and wisdom, that far exceeded anything possessed by mortal beings. Hylia's role in the cosmic order was that of a guardian and protector, one whose sacred duty was to watch over the Triforce and ensure that it remained safe from those who would misuse its power. She had witnessed the departure of the Golden Goddesses with mixed feelings, understanding their need to move beyond the realm they had created, while also recognizing the enormous responsibility that their departure placed upon her shoulders. The goddess had made her home on the surface world, dwelling among the creatures that had been blessed with life and consciousness by Farore's breath. She had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen the first tentative steps toward cooperation between different species, and had quietly guided the development of cultures that embodied the best qualities the goddesses had hoped to see in their creation. Hylia's power was vast, but not unlimited, for she had chosen to remain bound by many of the same natural laws that governed mortal existence. She could perform miracles that would seem impossible to ordinary beings, could speak directly to the hearts of those who sought her guidance, and could manifest herself in forms ranging from pure light to seemingly mortal flesh. Yet she could not simply wave her hand and banish Demise and his forces from existence, for to do so would violate the fundamental principle of free will that the Golden Goddesses had woven into the very fabric of reality. As the signs of approaching darkness multiplied, and the shadow of Demise's malice began to fall across the surface world, Hylia understood that the time for passive observation was coming to an end. The Demon King's power was growing too great to be contained by subtle influence and gentle guidance. Soon, she would need to take direct action to protect both the Triforce and the countless innocent lives that would be lost if Demise succeeded in his plans. The goddess began her own preparations for the war she knew was coming. She reached out to the most worthy among the surface dwellers, those individuals whose hearts embodied the virtues of power, wisdom, and courage that the Triforce represented. These chosen ones would become her champions in the battles ahead, mortals who would be blessed with a portion of her own divine strength and entrusted with the sacred mission of standing against the forces of darkness. Among these early heroes were the ancestors of peoples who would play crucial roles in the conflicts of later ages. The Sheikah, those shadow folk whose loyalty to the goddess would endure across countless generations, began to develop the mystical arts and ancient technologies that would make them invaluable allies in the war against evil. The Gorons, with their natural strength and their hearts full of courage, pledged their mountain fortresses to Hylia's cause. The Zora offered their wisdom and their mastery of the waters, while other races contributed their own unique gifts to the growing alliance. Yet even as she gathered mortal allies around her, Hylia understood that the coming conflict would demand sacrifices beyond anything that had been asked of the surface world before. Demise's power was ancient and terrible, fed by eons of accumulated malice and strengthened by the very act of opposing the natural order. The war that was coming would not be won through conventional battles alone, no matter how bravely fought or how skillfully planned. The goddess began to consider possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable in more peaceful times. If she could not defeat Demise while bound by the limitations she had accepted, perhaps she would need to transcend those limitations, even if doing so required her to make the ultimate sacrifice. The Triforce was meant to be used by mortals, not by divine beings. But what if a goddess could voluntarily surrender her divinity and become mortal herself? Such a transformation would be irreversible and would strip her of much of the power she had wielded for countless ages. She would become vulnerable to physical harm, subject to the passage of time, and dependent upon the same fragile life force that sustained all mortal creatures. Yet, in exchange, she would gain the ability to wield the Triforce directly, to use its power in ways that no purely divine being could ever contemplate. As Hylia pondered this desperate possibility, the signs of Demise's approaching assault multiplied across the surface world. Strange storms began to rage in regions that had known only gentle weather, while the very ground in certain areas began to crack and bleed a substance that was neither water nor any other natural liquid. Plants withered and died for no apparent reason, while animals fled from regions where invisible corruption was beginning to seep up from the depths of the earth. The Demon King's advanced forces began to appear on the surface, creatures of shadow and malice that attacked without warning and disappeared before any organized defense could be mounted against them. These raids were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned strikes designed to spread terror and weaken the resolve of those who might otherwise stand against the coming darkness. Villages that had known only peace for generations found themselves under assault by monsters that seemed to emerge from nightmare itself. Warriors who had trained their entire lives for battles against mortal enemies discovered that their weapons and tactics were inadequate against foes that defied the natural laws governing life and death. The very concept of organized resistance began to seem impossible in the face of an enemy that struck from the shadows and could not be anticipated or countered through conventional means. It was during this time of growing desperation that Hylia made her fateful decision. She would not wait for Demise to grow strong enough to threaten the Triforce directly, nor would she allow the suffering of innocents to continue while she searched for some perfect solution that might never come. Instead, she would act decisively, using every resource at her disposal to ensure that the forces of light would ultimately triumph over darkness, regardless of the personal cost to herself. The goddess's plan was complex and would require precise timing across multiple ages to reach completion. She would need to prepare not only for the immediate conflict with Demise, but also for the possibility that the Demon King might find some way to return even after his defeat. The plan she conceived would span generations and would require the cooperation of heroes yet to be born. But it offered the best hope for ensuring that the light would never be completely extinguished from the world. The first phase of Hylia's strategy involved the creation of a weapon specifically designed to combat the forces of darkness. This would not be an ordinary blade, no matter how skillfully forged or how powerfully enchanted, but something that partook of the divine essence itself. The sword she envisioned would be capable of harming beings that existed partially outside the normal flow of reality, and it would grow stronger rather than weaker when wielded against the forces of pure evil. To create such a weapon, Hylia would need to sacrifice a portion of her own divine essence, binding her consciousness and power into a form that could be wielded by mortal hands. This sacrifice would weaken her considerably, leaving her more vulnerable to Demise's attacks. But it would also create a tool that could strike at the very heart of the Demon King's power. The goddess began the lengthy and painful process of forging what would come to be known as the Master Sword, though in its earliest form it would be called the Goddess Sword. Into this blade she poured not only her power, but also her consciousness, creating a spirit guardian that would guide and advise whoever proved worthy to wield the sacred weapon. This spirit, who would eventually be known as Phi, was a fragment of Hylia herself, blessed with perfect logical understanding and unwavering dedication to the mission of protecting the innocent and defeating evil. The creation of the Goddess Sword required enormous amounts of spiritual energy, leaving Hylia weakened at the very moment when Demise's forces were growing strongest. Yet she pressed forward with her preparations, knowing that every day of delay would mean more suffering for the innocents who were already falling victim to the Demon King's advanced forces. As she worked, the goddess also began to implement another crucial aspect of her plan. The surface world, for all its beauty and wonder, would become a battlefield where mortal creatures could not hope to survive the full fury of conflict between divine and demonic forces. She would need to find some way to preserve the innocent lives that would otherwise be lost in the chaos that was coming. high above the surface world, floating among the clouds where no earthbound creature had ever ventured. Hylia began to prepare a sanctuary. Using power that drew upon the very foundations of reality itself, she lifted a portion of the surface into the heavens, creating an island in the sky where her chosen people could find safety while the war raged below. This floating sanctuary would come to be known as Skyloft, and it would serve as humanity's refuge during the darkest period of their history. The goddess selected those mortals who showed the greatest promise, individuals whose descendants might one day produce the heroes she would need to complete her plan, and transported them to their new home among the clouds. The process of lifting Skyloft into the heavens required Hylia to expend even more of her rapidly diminishing divine power, but she considered the cost worthwhile. The humans who would inhabit the floating island would be safe from Demise's direct attacks, and they would have time to develop the skills and traditions that would be needed when the moment came for them to play their part in the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Yet even as she prepared these refuges and weapons, Hylia understood that her greatest sacrifice still lay ahead. The plan she had conceived would require not just the surrender of her divine power, but the abandonment of her immortal existence. She would need to die as a goddess, so that she might be reborn as a mortal, capable of wielding the Triforce in ways that no divine being ever could. This reincarnation would not happen immediately, for the timing would need to be precisely coordinated with the emergence of a hero capable of completing the trials necessary to master the goddess sword and claim the Triforce. The goddess would need to ensure that her mortal incarnation would be born at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right circumstances, to fulfill the destiny that was being woven across the ages. As Demise's forces finally emerged from the depths in overwhelming numbers, beginning the open war that would devastate the surface world, Hylia made her final preparations for the ultimate sacrifice. She had done everything within her power to ensure that the forces of light would have the tools and opportunities they needed to achieve victory, but success would ultimately depend on the choices made by individuals she would never meet, heroes who had yet to be born. The great war between the forces of light and darkness raged across the surface world with a fury that shook the very foundations of reality. Demise's army of monsters swept across continents like a plague of living nightmares, destroying everything in their path and corrupting the very ground they walked upon. The allied forces that Hylia had gathered fought bravely, but they were vastly outnumbered by foes that seemed to grow stronger with every victory they achieved. Battle after battle was fought and lost as the demon army pressed forward toward their ultimate goal. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and rubble in a matter of days. Entire species of creatures that had flourished under the goddess's blessing were driven to the brink of extinction. The very concept of hope began to seem like a luxury that the surface world could no longer afford. Yet, even in the darkest moments of the war, when Demise's victory seemed all but assured, Hylia continued to fight. She wielded powers that made mountains tremble and seas boil. She summoned storms of pure light that could reduce entire demon armies to nothing, and she stood as the last barrier between the forces of evil and the sacred realm where the Triforce waited. But the goddess knew that brute force alone would never be enough to defeat an enemy whose very existence was sustained by malice and hatred. Demise drew power from conflict itself, growing stronger with every act of destruction he witnessed and every scream of anguish he heard. A conventional victory over such a foe was impossible. Only through sacrifice and transformation could the forces of light hope to achieve the miracle they so desperately needed. In the final, desperate moments of the war, as Demise himself appeared upon the battlefield in all his terrible glory, Hylia made the choice that would echo across all the ages to come. She channeled the last of her divine power not into a weapon of destruction, but into a seal of binding, a mystical prison that would contain the Demon King's essence and prevent him from completing his work of devastation. The seal she created was not perfect, for such absolute binding would have required power that only the golden goddesses themselves possessed. Instead, it was a temporary measure, a way of buying time for the forces of light to prepare for the final confrontation that would eventually come. Demise would remain imprisoned, but his malice would slowly eat away at the bonds that held him, and eventually he would break free to threaten the world once more. As the seal closed around the Demon King, trapping him in a prison woven from divine light and unbreakable determination, Hylia felt her own life force beginning to fade. The power she had expended in creating the binding was the last of what she possessed as a divine being, and she could feel her immortal existence slipping away like water through her fingers. Yet even as death approached, the goddess felt not despair but hope, for her plan was finally beginning to unfold as she had envisioned it. Her consciousness would not simply cease to exist, but would be reborn in mortal form, as a human girl who would grow up among the people of Skyloft. This mortal incarnation would possess the wisdom and courage needed to play her part in the final defeat of evil, but she would also have the vulnerability and humanity necessary to wield the Triforce when the time was right. The spirit guardian Fee, bound within the goddess sword, would wait patiently for the emergence of a hero worthy to claim the sacred blade. This chosen one would be guided through trials that would forge his spirit into something unbreakable, teaching him the wisdom, power, and courage he would need to face the ultimate test. Together, the reborn goddess and the hero would complete what Hylia herself could not accomplish, using the Triforce to banish darkness from the world forever. As Hylia's divine form dissolved into particles of golden light that scattered on the wind, carried away to whatever realm awaits beings who sacrifice their immortality for the good of others, the surface world began the slow process of healing from the wounds that war had inflicted upon it. The seal holding demise would endure for countless generations, giving the world time to recover and prepare for the trials that lay ahead. In the sky above, the people of Skyloft looked down upon a surface world that had been transformed by conflict but not destroyed. They did not yet understand the role they would play in the cosmic drama that was still unfolding, nor did they realize that among them would be born both the hero and the goddess who would complete the work that had begun with such sacrifice and determination. The age of Hylia had ended, but the age of the hero was yet to come, when courage and love would prove stronger than hatred and despair, and when the golden light of the Triforce would finally shine forth to banish the last shadows of ancient evil from the world. In the ages that followed the sealing of demise and the sacrifice of the goddess Hylia, when the surface world slowly began to heal from the wounds that ancient war had carved into its very foundations, the sacred realm became a place of pilgrimage and wonder unlike any other location in the known universe. Here, in this dimension that existed adjacent to mortal reality, the Triforce rested in perfect tranquility, its golden light casting gentle radiance through crystal formations that had grown according to mathematical principles of divine beauty. The unified Triforce, whole and complete in its sacred sanctuary, became the cornerstone of an age of unprecedented prosperity and harmony. Unlike the later eras when the sacred relic would be split among chosen bearers or hidden away from those who might misuse its power, these were the golden years when the three virtues of power, wisdom, and courage existed in perfect balance, their combined influence radiating outward to bless all of creation with stability and growth. The very presence of the complete Triforce in its proper resting place acted like a great heart pumping life and vitality throughout the interconnected web of reality. Its influence was subtle but pervasive, like sunlight that nurtures growing things without overwhelming them, like the gentle current of a river that shapes the landscape through patient persistence rather than violent force. Under this benevolent influence, the surface world that had been devastated by the war between light and darkness began to flourish in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic dreams of those who had survived the ancient conflict. Where once there had been wastelands poisoned by demonic corruption, new forests began to grow, their trees stronger and more beautiful than any that had existed before the time of troubles. Rivers that had run red with the blood of fallen heroes now flowed crystal clear, their waters carrying not the memory of sorrow but the promise of renewal. The very air seemed cleaner and more refreshing, as if the Triforce's presence had purified not only the land but the atmosphere itself, removing lingering traces of the malice that had once threatened to corrupt everything it touched. The surviving peoples of the surface world, those hardy souls who had endured the dark years through courage and mutual support, found themselves blessed with abundance beyond anything their ancestors had known. Crops grew larger and more nutritious, requiring less labor to cultivate and producing yields that could feed populations far larger than had seemed possible during the lean years of conflict and recovery. The various races that called Hyrule home began to develop distinct cultures and traditions that reflected their unique relationships with the natural world around them. The Hylians, those humans who bore the pointed ears that marked their sensitivity to divine influence, spread across the fertile plains and rolling hills that formed the heart of the kingdom. Their natural adaptability and diplomatic instincts made them ideal mediators between the other races, while their technological innovation led to advances in architecture, agriculture, and the arts that benefited everyone. In the mountainous regions where volcanic activity created landscapes of dramatic beauty and considerable danger, the Gorons established their first permanent settlements. These gentle giants, whose rocky skin allowed them to withstand temperatures that would prove fatal to most other creatures, developed a culture based on strength, honor, and communal cooperation. Their natural ability to work with metals and gems made them invaluable trading partners, while their cheerful dispositions and generous hearts made them beloved allies to all who knew them. The Zora, those graceful aquatic people whose understanding of water in all its forms bordered on the mystical, claimed the pristine lakes and rivers that flowed through Hyrule's diverse landscape. Their long lifespans and patient wisdom made them natural keepers of history and lore, while their mastery of healing arts brought comfort to those who suffered from injury or illness. The architecture they developed seemed to flow like frozen water, creating structures that were both beautiful and perfectly functional. High in the mountain peaks where the air grew thin and the winds sang eternal songs of ice and snow, the Rito people made their homes among the crags and cliff faces that offered perfect launching points for their magnificent flights. These proud bird folk served as messengers and scouts, their ability to soar through the heavens, making them invaluable for maintaining communication across the vast distances of the growing kingdom. Their keen eyes missed nothing that moved across the landscape below, while their musical traditions enriched the cultural life of all who heard their songs. In the vast desert regions where the sun blazed with merciless intensity and water was more precious than gold, the Gerudo people built their fortress cities amid the shifting sands. These warrior women, born to a harsh land that demanded strength and cunning for survival, developed a culture that prized martial excellence and fierce loyalty. Their skill in combat was matched by their expertise as traders and craftswomen, their caravans carrying goods and news across distances that would have daunted less determined travelers. Each of these races brought their own gifts to the growing civilization that was taking shape across the surface world, but they also learned from one another in ways that strengthened the whole beyond what any individual culture could have achieved alone. Goron metallurgy, combined with Hylian innovation to create tools and weapons of unprecedented quality. Zora healing knowledge, merged with Gerudo-alchemical traditions to develop medicines that could cure ailments that had once been considered hopeless. Rito aerial reconnaissance supported Hylian agricultural planning to maximize crop yields across regions that had previously been considered marginal for farming. The capital city that grew up around the gateway to the sacred realm became a marvel of cooperative achievement, where architectural styles from every culture blended into something entirely new, yet respectful of ancient traditions. Markets bustled with goods from every corner of the known world, while scholars from different races collaborated on projects that advanced understanding of everything from astronomy to medicine to the mystical arts. The Temple of Time, that sacred structure which guarded the entrance to the realm where the Triforce rested, became the spiritual heart of this growing civilization. Built according to architectural principles that seemed to embody mathematical perfection, its soaring spires and graceful arches created a space that felt simultaneously grounded in earthly reality and connected to divine inspiration. Within the temple's hallowed halls, representatives of all the races came to offer prayers and seek guidance from the mysterious forces that governed existence itself. The ceremonies that developed around these observances were not rigid dogma imposed by any single authority, but organic expressions of shared reverence that allowed each culture to contribute its own understanding of the sacred, while participating in something greater than any individual tradition. The priests and priestesses who served in the Temple of Time were drawn from every race and background, united not by uniform belief, but by their dedication to preserving the wisdom and protecting the sacred trust that had been placed in their care. These spiritual leaders worked together to develop rituals and practices that honored the memory of the goddess Hylia, while also acknowledging the ongoing presence of the divine forces that continued to shape the world. Yet even as this golden age of prosperity and cooperation flourished under the benevolent influence of the unified Triforce, there were those who began to covet the source of such wonderful blessings. Power, even when wielded with perfect wisdom and courage, inevitably attracts the attention of those who believe they could use such might to achieve their own ends, regardless of the consequences for others. These individuals were not necessarily evil in the same way that Demise and his demonic forces had been evil. They were not creatures of pure malice, seeking only destruction and suffering for its own sake. Rather, they were beings whose understanding of good and evil had become twisted by their desire for control, people who genuinely believed that they knew better than the natural order, how the world should be shaped and governed. Some among these potential usurpers were motivated by what they saw as noble goals. They looked upon the suffering that still existed in the world, the inequalities and hardships that persisted despite the overall prosperity of the age, and convinced themselves that with sufficient power, they could eliminate such problems permanently. Their intentions may have been admirable, but their methods revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of existence itself. Others were driven by more selfish desires, though they often disguised these motivations. Even from themselves, they saw the influence and respect accorded to the various rulers and spiritual leaders of the age and wanted such recognition for themselves. They believed that their own wisdom exceeded that of those currently in positions of authority, and they convinced themselves that the world would be better served if they possessed the ultimate power to reshape it according to their vision. The most dangerous of these potential threats to the cosmic order were those who had studied the mystical arts deeply enough to understand something of the true nature of the Triforce and the sacred realm. These individuals were not content to simply dream about wielding divine power. They began to develop actual plans for claiming what they believed should rightfully belong to those with sufficient wisdom and strength to use it properly. Among these ambitious sorcerers and would-be conquerors were the beings who would eventually come to be known as the interlopers, though in these early days, they were simply skilled practitioners of magical arts who had allowed their knowledge to corrupt their judgment. They had delved deeply into the study of shadow magic, those mystical techniques that drew power from the spaces between light and darkness. The Twilight Realms, where normal rules began to break down. Shadow magic was not inherently evil, any more than fire or water or any other natural force was inherently good or evil. Like all forms of power, it could be used for beneficial or harmful purposes, depending upon the wisdom and intentions of those who wielded it. The ancient Shaker had mastered many shadow techniques and used them in service of the goddess and the protection of the innocent. But shadow magic was also particularly susceptible to corruption by those who allowed their desire for power to override their concern for the consequences of their actions. The interlopers began their studies with genuine curiosity about the nature of reality and the forces that shaped existence. They were scholars and philosophers who wanted to understand the deeper mysteries of creation, to comprehend the principles that governed the interaction between light and darkness, order and chaos, life and death. Their early work contributed significantly to the overall knowledge of the age, and many of their discoveries genuinely benefited the people of Hyrule. But as their power grew and their understanding deepened, some among them began to believe that they had transcended the normal limitations that bound other mortals. They convinced themselves that their superior knowledge gave them the right, even the obligation, to reshape the world according to their own vision of what would be best for everyone. They began to see the current order, peaceful and prosperous though it was, as an impediment to the perfect society they believed they could create. The corruption that gradually consumed the interlopers was subtle at first, manifesting as intellectual pride and a growing disdain for those they considered less enlightened than themselves. They began to gather in secret, sharing their knowledge and their ambitions with like-minded individuals who had also begun to believe that they deserved to wield greater influence over the course of events. These secret gatherings gradually evolved into something resembling a conspiracy, though the participants would have rejected such a characterization of their activities. They saw themselves as visionaries working to bring about a better world, reformers who had the courage to challenge an imperfect system, despite the personal risks such challenges might entail. They convinced themselves that their cause was so noble that any methods necessary to achieve it were justified. As their organization grew in size and ambition, the interlopers began to develop increasingly sophisticated techniques for manipulating shadow magic in ways that had never been attempted before. They learned to bend darkness to their will, to travel through dimensions that existed parallel to normal reality, and to influence the thoughts and emotions of others through mystical means that left no obvious traces. Their ultimate goal was nothing less than the conquest of the sacred realm and the claiming of the Triforce for themselves. They believed that with such power at their disposal, they could eliminate all suffering from the world, could create a perfect society where everyone lived in harmony and prosperity under their wise guidance. They could not see, or chose not to acknowledge, that their methods and motivations had already corrupted them beyond redemption. The plan they developed was complex and would require precise coordination among numerous participants working across multiple dimensions simultaneously. They would use their mastery of shadow magic to breach the barriers that protected the sacred realm, overwhelming its defenses through sheer numbers and superior technique, rather than attempting to meet the spiritual requirements that were meant to govern access to the Triforce. Once they had claimed the sacred relic, they would use its power to reshape not only the surface world, but the very foundations of reality itself. They envisioned a cosmos where suffering was impossible, where conflict could never arise, where every being would live in perfect contentment under the benevolent tyranny of those wise enough to make all decisions for everyone else. The irony of their plan was lost on them completely. In their quest to eliminate all sources of discord and unhappiness from existence, they would necessarily eliminate the free will that the golden goddesses had identified as the most precious gift they could bestow upon their creation. The perfect world they envisioned would be a prison where no genuine choice was possible, where every action and thought was predetermined by their own understanding of what would be best for everyone. As the interlopers prepared to implement their grand design, gathering their forces and making their final preparations for the assault on the sacred realm, they remained blissfully unaware that their activities had not gone entirely unnoticed. The balance that the Triforce maintained was delicate, and any significant disruption in the cosmic order created ripples that could be detected by those who knew how to recognize such disturbances. The light spirits, those divine beings who served as guardians of specific regions and who maintained a connection to the sacred realm through their service to the goddess, began to sense that something was amiss. These entities were not as powerful as Hylia herself had been, but they possessed wisdom accumulated across countless ages and an understanding of the natural order that made them sensitive to any attempts to subvert or corrupt it. The light spirits had watched over their respective regions since the end of the Great War against Demise, providing subtle guidance and protection to the mortals who lived under their care. They were not rulers in any conventional sense, for they rarely intervened directly in mortal affairs, but their presence could be felt by those who were sensitive to spiritual influences, a gentle reassurance that the forces of light had not abandoned the world to darkness. As the disturbances created by the interlopers' activities grew more pronounced, the light spirits began to communicate with one another across the mystical networks that connected their domains. They shared their observations and their concerns, gradually piecing together a picture of what was being planned and recognizing the enormous threat that such a scheme posed to everything they had sworn to protect. The light spirits understood that the interlopers' plan, if successful, would not merely result in the theft of the Triforce, but would fundamentally corrupt the sacred relic itself. Power claimed through treachery and used for selfish ends, no matter how noble those ends might seem to those who pursued them, would inevitably become tainted by the methods used to obtain it. The perfect world the interlopers envisioned would become a nightmare realm where genuine happiness was impossible because genuine choice had been eliminated. Working together with the same patience and careful planning that had characterized their centuries of service, the light spirits began to prepare countermeasures that would protect the sacred realm from the coming assault. They could not simply prevent the attack from taking place, for that would require them to violate the same principles of free will that the interlopers themselves were threatening to destroy. Instead, they would need to allow the conspiracy to unfold while ensuring that its ultimate consequences would serve the cause of justice rather than tyranny. The plan that the light spirits developed was as elegant as it was terrible in its implications for those who had chosen the path of corruption. They would allow the interlopers to breach the barriers protecting the sacred realm, to come face to face with the Triforce itself, but they would ensure that the sacred relic remained beyond their reach. More than that, they would turn the interlopers' own power against them, using their mastery of shadow magic as the instrument of their punishment. When the assault on the sacred realm finally began, it unfolded exactly as the interlopers had planned in their most optimistic projections. Their forces, strengthened by years of preparation and unified by their shared vision of the perfect world they would create, swept through the mystical barriers that protected the divine sanctuary like a plague of living shadows. Their techniques proved more than adequate to overcome defenses that had been designed to exclude individual seekers rather than organized armies. The sight that greeted them as they entered the heart of the sacred realm was everything they had dreamed of and more. The Triforce hung suspended in golden radiance at the center of a crystal chamber whose walls reflected and amplified its light in patterns of mathematical perfection. The very air seemed to pulse with divine energy, and the assembled interlopers could feel power beyond imagination, calling to them from across the chamber. Yet as they moved forward to claim their prize, the light spirits struck with timing so perfect that it seemed choreographed by the gods themselves. The shadow magic that the interlopers had used to breach the sacred realm's defenses was turned back upon them, but instead of simply destroying them, it transformed them in ways that were both merciful and terrible. The divine intervention did not kill the would-be conquerors, but instead banished them to a realm where their corrupted understanding of perfection could be fully realized. They were cast into a dimension that existed parallel to the normal world, a place where light and shadow existed in eternal twilight, where the harsh edges of reality were softened, but where nothing could ever grow or change or truly live. This twilight realm, as it would come to be known, was both punishment and mercy for those who had allowed their noble intentions to be corrupted by their desire for absolute control. Here they could exist in the perfect stasis they had sought to impose upon the rest of creation, but they would discover that such perfection was indistinguishable from living death, that a world without genuine choice was a world without genuine meaning. The banishment of the interlopers sent shockwaves through the mystical communities of the surface world, serving as a stark reminder that power without wisdom inevitably leads to corruption, and that the road to tyranny is often paved with the best of intentions. The scholars and sorcerers who had admired the interlopers' knowledge and achievements were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that intelligence and noble goals were not sufficient protection against the seductive influence of absolute power. In the aftermath of the failed assault on the sacred realm, the various rulers and spiritual leaders of Hyrule gathered to discuss what safeguards might be implemented to prevent similar threats from arising in the future. The golden age of innocence and trust was ending, replaced by a more mature understanding of the dangers that inevitably accompany great power and the vigilance required to protect sacred trusts from those who would abuse them. The Temple of Time was fortified and its access more strictly controlled, though not in ways that would prevent legitimate seekers from approaching the gateway to the sacred realm. The Master Sword, that blade which had been forged from the goddess's own essence, was placed as a final guardian before the door of time, ensuring that only one who possessed the spirit of the true hero could pass beyond into the sacred sanctuary. The various races of Hyrule also began to develop their own traditions and institutions for identifying and training those who showed aptitude for the mystical arts, ensuring that such power would be wielded responsibly and with proper understanding of the obligations it entailed. The Shaker, in particular, took upon themselves the role of secret guardians, watching from the shadows for signs of corruption or conspiracy that might threaten the peace and stability of the realm. Yet even as these precautions were implemented and the immediate crisis passed, the wise among the people understood that the threat posed by the interlopers had been symptomatic of deeper issues that could not be solved through vigilance alone. The very success and prosperity of the Golden Age had created conditions that made some individuals susceptible to the belief that they deserved to wield power over others, that their superior knowledge or ability gave them the right to make decisions for everyone else. The challenge facing the kingdom was how to maintain the benefits of peace and prosperity, while also preserving the humility and wisdom necessary to use such blessings responsibly. This would require not just external safeguards but internal spiritual discipline, the cultivation of virtues that would make individuals resistant to the corrupting influence of power, even when that power was offered to them freely. The sages and spiritual leaders of the age began to develop teachings and practices designed to help people understand the true nature of the three virtues represented by the Triforce. Power without wisdom led to destruction, they taught, while wisdom without courage remained forever inactive and ineffective. Most importantly, all three virtues needed to be balanced by love and compassion for others, for without such grounding, even the greatest abilities could become instruments of oppression rather than liberation. As the years passed and the immediate memory of the interloper crisis began to fade, the people of Hyrule gradually settled into new patterns of life that incorporated the lessons learned from their brush with tyranny. The kingdom remained prosperous and peaceful, but its prosperity was tempered by awareness of how easily good fortune could be lost, and its peace was maintained through active vigilance rather than passive assumption that threats would never arise. The Triforce continued to rest in its sacred sanctuary, its golden light a constant reminder that true power must always be balanced by wisdom and courage, that the greatest strength lies not in the ability to control others, but in the discipline to control oneself. The age of prosperity continued, but it was now a mature prosperity, one that understood both its blessings and its responsibilities, both its potential for good and its vulnerability to corruption. In the Twilight Realm, where they had been banished, the former interlopers began the long process of coming to understand the true consequences of their choices. Cut off from the vibrant life of the surface world, existing in a state of perpetual half-light, where nothing ever truly changed, they had ample time to reflect on the difference between the perfect world they had envisioned and the sterile reality they had created for themselves. Some among them eventually achieved a measure of wisdom through their suffering, coming to understand that their greatest error had not been in desiring to help others, but in believing that they alone possessed the wisdom necessary to determine what form such help should take. These repentant souls would eventually find ways to serve the cause of light even from their exile, though their service would be measured in centuries rather than years, and their contributions would be subtle rather than dramatic. Others remained convinced of their own righteousness, certain that their banishment was simply the result of a cosmic injustice that prevented them from implementing the perfect society they had envisioned. These unrepentant spirits would continue to scheme and plot across the ages, always seeking some way to return to the surface world and complete the work they believed they had been chosen to accomplish. The legacy of the Interloper War, as it came to be known in the historical records, was thus a complex mixture of wisdom gained and innocence lost, of protections implemented and trust necessarily compromised. The surface world emerged from the crisis stronger and more resilient, better prepared to face the challenges that the future would inevitably bring, but also forever changed by its encounter with the seductive dangers of absolute power and the eternal vigilance required to keep such dangers in check. In the years that followed the banishment of the interlopers and the establishment of new safeguards around the sacred realm, the kingdom of Hyrule settled into a period of cautious prosperity that would endure for countless generations. The Triforce remained secure in its crystal sanctuary, watched over by the Master Sword and protected by barriers both mystical and mundane, while the surface world grew and flourished under the gentle guidance of wise rulers who understood the precious nature of the peace they had inherited. Yet even in times of greatest tranquility, the wheel of fate continues to turn, bringing with each revolution new challenges that test the strength and wisdom of those who would preserve the light against the ever-present possibility of darkness returning. The ancient seal that bound Demise in his prison of divine light was not eternal, for no mortal magic, no matter how skillfully wrought, could hold such concentrated malice forever without eventually beginning to weaken and fray. Deep beneath the desert sands where the Gerudo people had built their great fortress cities, in caverns so far below the surface that no living creature had ever walked their twisted passages, something stirred in the darkness with the patience of geological ages. The essence of the Demon King, though bound and weakened by centuries of imprisonment, had not been destroyed, and through the long years of his captivity he had learned to draw sustenance from the hatred and despair that mortals generated through their conflicts and sufferings. This was not the crude, overwhelming malice that had characterized Demise in his original form, but something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. Through his long imprisonment, the ancient evil had evolved, learning to work through mortal agents rather than relying solely on demonic armies, discovering how to corrupt existing desires rather than imposing alien ones, mastering the art of turning noble intentions into instruments of destruction. The vessel through which this refined malice would enter the world was born among the Gerudo people in the manner prescribed by their ancient traditions. But from the moment of his birth it was clear that this child was unlike any other in their proud history. The boy who would be named Ganondorf carried within his mortal flesh a spark of something that transcended normal existence, a connection to power so ancient and terrible that even the wisest among the Gerudo could not fully comprehend what had been born into their midst. The traditions of the Gerudo people dictated that the rare male born among their warrior sisterhood would become their king, ruling over the desert realm with the strength and wisdom that their harsh homeland demanded. Yet from his earliest years, it became apparent that Ganondorf possessed not just the natural authority that his birthright implied, but an almost supernatural charisma that could bend others to his will through sheer force of personality. As he grew from child to youth to man, Ganondorf proved himself to be everything the Gerudo could have hoped for in a leader and more. His physical strength was legendary even among a people famous for their martial prowess. His tactical brilliance turned the tide of countless skirmishes with rival tribes, and his diplomatic skills opened trade routes that brought unprecedented prosperity to the Desert Kingdom. Yet those few who possessed the sensitivity to perceive beyond the physical realm began to notice something troubling about the young king's rapid rise to power. There was a quality to his presence that seemed to drain light from the spaces around him, a subtle wrongness that made wise individuals uneasy without being able to articulate exactly what disturbed them about the otherwise admirable ruler. The corruption that flowed through Ganondorf's veins was not yet strong enough to overcome his mortal nature completely, but it influenced his thoughts and desires in ways that gradually steered him toward choices that served the ancient malice rather than the good of his people. He began to dream of conquest, not just of neighboring territories, but of the entire surface world. Visions of power and dominion that seemed to come from some external source rather than his own ambitions. These dreams were accompanied by fragmentary memories that did not belong to his mortal existence, glimpses of cosmic battles fought before his birth, and knowledge of secrets that no living being should possess. Most significantly, he began to develop an obsessive fascination with the legends of the Triforce, that sacred relic whose location and nature were known only through ancient stories, passed down through generations of storytellers. The more Ganondorf learned about the Triforce, the more convinced he became that he alone possessed the wisdom and strength necessary to claim it and use its power for the betterment of all creation. He could not see, or chose not to acknowledge, that his desire to possess the sacred relic was being shaped by forces beyond his conscious awareness, that the very intensity of his longing was evidence of the corruption that was slowly consuming his soul. As the years passed and Ganondorf consolidated his power over the Gerudo people, preparing them for the great conquest he believed was their destiny, Events were also unfolding in other parts of Hyrule that would prove crucial to the drama that was taking shape. In the deep forests where the Kokiri people lived their eternal childhood under the protection of the great Deku Tree, a boy was growing up who seemed destined for something far greater than his humble origins might suggest. Link had been found as an infant in the forest depths, with no memory of his parents or his origins, bearing only the name by which the Deku Tree had chosen to call him. The great guardian spirit had taken the orphan child under his protection, allowing him to grow up among the Kokiri as if he were one of their own, though even in his earliest years, it was apparent that he was different from the forest children in fundamental ways. Unlike the Kokiri, who remained eternally young and carefree under the Deku Tree's blessing, Link aged and grew, as normal humans do, his body maturing, while his mind developed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from facing real challenges rather than living in perpetual innocence. More significantly, he possessed a natural aptitude for combat and adventure that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity, as if some deeper purpose was driving him to develop skills that would one day be needed for tasks he could not yet imagine. The great Deku Tree, ancient beyond mortal comprehension and wise in the ways of forest magic, watched over Link's development with eyes that could perceive the threads of destiny weaving themselves around the growing youth. The guardian spirit understood that this child who had been placed in his care was no ordinary orphan, but the latest incarnation of the eternal hero, the mortal soul that was destined to stand against darkness whenever it threatened to overwhelm the world. Yet the Deku Tree also understood that the hero's destiny could not be forced or hurried, that Link would need to discover his true nature through trials and challenges that would forge his spirit into something capable of bearing the tremendous responsibility that awaited him. The ancient guardian, therefore, allowed the boy to grow and learn at his own pace, providing guidance and protection when necessary, but never revealing the full scope of what lay ahead. As Link approached his 17th birthday, the signs that his time among the Kokiri was drawing to a close began to manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored. He experienced dreams that seemed more like memories of lives he had never lived, visions of battles fought with weapons he had never touched, and encounters with people he had never met, yet somehow recognized. Most disturbing of all, he began to hear a voice calling to him from somewhere beyond the forest, a summons that grew stronger with each passing day. The voice belonged to Princess Zelda, though Link could not know this, for the mortal incarnation of the goddess Hylia had inherited more than just divine wisdom and courage. She had also been blessed with prophetic dreams that revealed glimpses of the approaching crisis, visions of darkness spreading across the land and heroes rising to meet it. In her dreams, she saw a young man whose courage would prove crucial to the battles ahead, and she reached out to him across the mystical networks that connected all living things. Princess Zelda had grown up in the royal court with full knowledge of her sacred heritage and the responsibilities that came with it. Yet she also understood that knowledge alone would not be sufficient to face the trials that were approaching. She would need allies, companions whose strength could complement her own wisdom, and most importantly, she would need the hero whose destiny was intertwined with her own, across all the cycles of reincarnation that stretched back to the first conflict between light and darkness. The princess's attempts to contact Link through dreams and visions were complicated by the protective barriers that the great Deku Tree maintained around the forest realm, mystical defenses that were designed to keep harmful influences away from the innocent Kokiri, but which also interfered with beneficial communications from the outside world. Her messages reached the young hero only in fragmentary form, creating a sense of urgency and purpose without providing clear direction about what actions he should take. It was during this time of growing tension and unclear portents that Ganondorf finally decided to move beyond mere dreams of conquest and begin actively pursuing the power he believed was rightfully his. The Gerudo King had spent years studying the legends of the Triforce, gathering intelligence about its location and the defenses that protected it, and he had gradually developed a plan that seemed to offer genuine hope of success where others had failed. Unlike the interlopers, who had sought to claim the sacred relic through force and numbers, Ganondorf understood that the Triforce responded to the spiritual qualities of those who approached it rather than their magical abilities or military might. The challenge was not to overcome external defenses, but to present himself as someone worthy of wielding divine power, someone whose intentions were pure enough to satisfy whatever mystical requirements governed access to the sacred sanctuary. This requirement posed no difficulty for Ganondorf, for the corruption that flowed through his veins had not yet advanced to the point where it overwhelmed his capacity for self-deception. He genuinely believed that his desire to claim the Triforce was motivated by noble goals, that he alone possessed the vision and strength necessary to eliminate suffering and injustice from the world. He could not see that his very certainty of his own righteousness was evidence of the pride and arrogance that made him fundamentally unsuitable for the role he sought to claim. The Gerudo King's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications for the peace that Hyrule had enjoyed for so many generations. Rather than attempting to assault the sacred realm directly, he would present himself to the royal court as a potential ally, someone whose power and resources could benefit the kingdom through legitimate cooperation and trade agreements. Once he had gained the trust of Hyrule's rulers, he would use his position to learn the secrets of the Temple of Time and find some way to gain access to the chamber where the Triforce waited. Ganondorf's embassy to Hyrule Castle was received with the courtesy and respect due to a foreign ruler of his apparent stature, though some among the court sensed something troubling about their visitor that they could not quite articulate. The Gerudo King's charisma and diplomatic skill served him well in these initial encounters, allowing him to present himself as exactly the kind of strong but reasonable leader that Hyrule's peaceful kingdom would benefit from having as an ally. The negotiations that followed were conducted with all the ceremony and careful protocol that such important diplomatic exchanges required, but beneath the surface courtesies a more dangerous game was being played. Ganondorf used every opportunity to gather intelligence about the kingdom's defenses and the sacred traditions that governed access to the Temple of Time, while Princess Zelda found herself growing increasingly uneasy about their visitor's true intentions. The princess's discomfort was not based on any obvious evidence of wrongdoing, for Ganondorf was careful to present himself as entirely reasonable and honorable in all his dealings. Rather, it stemmed from her inherited sensitivity to spiritual corruption, a divine awareness that allowed her to perceive the darkness that was slowly consuming the Gerudo King's soul. Despite his own ignorance of what was happening to him, Zelda's concerns were shared by some among the court's wisest advisors, particularly those Sheikah retainers whose training in the mystical arts made them sensitive to the same spiritual emanations that troubled the princess. Yet their warnings were necessarily vague and circumstantial, based on intuition rather than concrete evidence, and they struggled to convince others that someone so apparently admirable might actually represent a terrible threat to the kingdom's safety. As the diplomatic negotiations continued, and Ganondorf gradually gained greater access to the castle and its secrets, Princess Zelda's prophetic dreams began to increase in both frequency and intensity. She saw visions of darkness spreading across the land like a plague, of ancient evil awakening from its long slumber, of battles that would reshape the very foundations of existence. Most disturbing of all, she saw herself and the mysterious forest youth standing together against overwhelming odds, their combined power, the only thing standing between creation and absolute destruction. These visions drove the princess to take increasingly desperate measures to locate the hero whose presence she had sensed in her dreams, reaching out through mystical networks that connected all who served the cause of light. Her attempts to make contact were hindered by her inexperience with such techniques and by the interference of the same dark forces that were slowly corrupting Ganondorf's soul, but gradually her messages began to reach their intended recipient. Link received the princess's communications as dreams that seemed more vivid and urgent than any normal nighttime visions, calling him away from the forest that had been his home toward adventures and responsibilities that he could not yet fully comprehend. The young hero found himself torn between loyalty to the Kokiri, who had raised him, and the growing certainty that his destiny lay elsewhere, that he had been prepared for some great task that could no longer be delayed. The resolution of this internal conflict came when the great Deku Tree, that ancient guardian who had watched over Link since infancy, finally acknowledged what they both already knew in their hearts. The time had come for the hero to leave the safety of the forest and claim his place in the great drama that was unfolding across the wider world. The guardian spirit's blessing would go with him, but from this point forward he would need to rely on his own courage and the allies he would gather along the way. Armed with the basic equipment that the Deku Tree had provided and guided by the fragments of prophetic vision that Princess Zelda had managed to share with him, Link set out from the forest toward the royal capital where his destiny awaited. He traveled with the confidence of youth and the unconscious certainty of someone whose path has been ordained by forces greater than mortal understanding, though he could not have anticipated the true magnitude of the challenges that lay ahead. The young hero's arrival at Hyrule Castle coincided with the culmination of Ganondorf's own carefully laid plans, though neither was initially aware of the other's significance to the approaching crisis. The Gerudo King had finally succeeded in gaining access to the Temple of Time, using his diplomatic status and carefully cultivated relationships to obtain the sacred knowledge that had been kept secret for so many generations. The revelation that the entrance to the sacred realm was protected not just by mystical barriers, but by a physical lock that required 3 spiritual keys, came as both surprise and opportunity to Ganondorf. The spiritual stones, as these keys were known, were in the possession of the 3 guardian races who served as protectors of Hyrule's most sacred traditions, and claiming them would require either their willing cooperation or the application of force sufficient to overcome their resistance. The task of gathering the spiritual stones seemed perfectly suited to someone with Link's unique combination of courage, resourcefulness, and heroic destiny, though the young man himself was only dimly aware of the cosmic significance of the quest he was undertaking. To him, it seemed like an adventure that would allow him to prove himself worthy of the trust that Princess Zelda had placed in him, a chance to demonstrate the skills and courage that had been developing within him since childhood. Link's quest to obtain the 3 spiritual stones took him to the far corners of Hyrule, where he encountered the guardian races in their ancient strongholds and proved himself worthy of their trust through deeds of courage and compassion that recalled the legendary heroes of ages past. From the Gorons of Death Mountain, he claimed the Goron's Ruby, demonstrating his bravery by facing dangers that would have daunted experienced warriors. The Zora's Sapphire came to him through his willingness to aid Princess Ruto in her time of need, showing that true heroism lay not in seeking glory but in helping those who could not help themselves. The final stone, the Kokiri's Emerald, was bestowed upon him by the great Deku Tree himself, in a ceremony that marked both the completion of Link's childhood among the forest folk and his full acceptance of the heroic destiny that awaited him. With all 3 spiritual stones in his possession, the young hero returned to Hyrule Castle to present them to Princess Zelda, believing that their combined efforts would soon unlock the path to the sacred realm and allow them to claim the Triforce for the forces of good. Yet even as Link completed his quest and prepared to open the door of time, Ganondorf was putting the final touches on his own plan to claim the sacred power that he believed was rightfully his. The Gerudo King had used the time during Link's absence to position his forces for a swift conquest of Hyrule Castle, preparing to seize control of the kingdom the moment the path to the sacred realm was opened. The deception that Ganondorf had practiced so skillfully throughout his stay at the royal court was finally revealed in the moment when Link used the spiritual stones to unlock the door of time. The massive portal that had remained sealed for countless generations slowly ground open, revealing the chamber beyond where the Master Sword waited in its stone pedestal. But the triumph that should have accompanied this achievement was overshadowed by the sound of violence erupting throughout the castle. Princess Zelda, whose prophetic gifts had warned her of the approaching betrayal, even if they could not reveal its exact timing, barely escaped from the castle as Ganondorf's forces overwhelmed its defenses and claimed it for their dark master. Her flight from her ancestral home, accompanied by her faithful guardian Impa, marked the beginning of a 7-year nightmare that would transform the kingdom beyond all recognition. Link, meanwhile, found himself drawn inexorably toward the Master Sword, that legendary blade which had been waiting for countless generations for a hero worthy to claim it. The young man who grasped the sacred weapon's hilt was filled with a sense of completion and purpose that transcended anything he had experienced in his forest childhood, as if he had finally found the missing piece of his own identity. Yet the Master Sword was more than just a weapon, and claiming it carried consequences that Link could not have anticipated. The blade had been designed not just to defeat evil, but to ensure that its wielder would be mature enough to handle the enormous responsibility that came with such power. The moment Link drew the sacred sword from its resting place, he was caught up in a mystical stasis that would preserve him in perfect safety while 7 years passed in the world outside. The chamber of the Master Sword became a sanctuary outside of normal time, where the young hero could grow from boyhood to manhood while remaining protected from the chaos that Ganondorf's conquest would bring to the surface world. It was a mercy disguised as imprisonment, a chance for Link to develop the wisdom and emotional maturity that would be necessary when the time came to face the full magnitude of his destined role. During those 7 years of Link's absence, Hyrule was transformed into a realm of shadow and despair under Ganondorf's tyrannical rule. The Gerudo King, having finally claimed the Triforce only to discover that it immediately split into its 3 component pieces, found himself in possession of only the Triforce of power, while the other 2 portions sought out bearers whose hearts embodied the remaining virtues. The Triforce of wisdom, recognizing the pure heart and noble intentions of Princess Zelda, came to rest within her as she began the dangerous work of organizing resistance against the usurper who had claimed her throne. The sacred relic granted her abilities that went far beyond her inherited gifts, allowing her to assume the identity of Sheik and work from the shadows to prepare for the hero's eventual return. Most significantly, the Triforce of Courage found its way to Link, even as he slept in mystical stasis, recognizing in him the same heroic spirit that had faced darkness in ages past, and would face it again in ages yet to come. The sacred relic would remain dormant within him until he awakened, but its presence ensured that when that moment arrived, he would possess power sufficient to challenge even the corrupted might that Ganondorf had claimed. The splitting of the Triforce created a dynamic that would define all the conflicts of the age, as three chosen individuals found themselves bound together by destiny and cosmic purpose despite being separated by loyalty and circumstance. Each possessed one portion of the divine power that had once rested whole in the sacred realm, and each would need to play their part in the final confrontation that would determine the fate of all creation. When Link finally awakened from his 7-year slumber, emerging from the Chamber of Sages as the adult hero that prophecy had foretold, he found himself in a world transformed beyond recognition by the consequences of choices made by others in his absence. The green tunic that had marked him as one of the Kokiri had been replaced by garments more suited to his new stature, while the Master Sword in his hands hummed with power that seemed to respond to his very thoughts and intentions. The hero who set forth from the Temple of Time to begin the quest that would liberate Hyrule from Ganondorf's tyrannical rule carried within himself not just the Triforce of Courage, but also the accumulated hopes and dreams of everyone who suffered under the Demon King's oppression. His journey would take him to every corner of the transformed kingdom, where he would awaken the ancient sages whose power would be necessary to breach the barriers that protected Ganondorf's stronghold. The battles that followed tested every aspect of Link's courage and skill, forcing him to confront not just external enemies, but also the internal doubts that inevitably arise when facing challenges that seem impossible to overcome. Each temple he cleansed, each sage he awakened, each small victory he achieved added to his strength and confidence, while also revealing the true magnitude of the task that lay before him. The final confrontation between hero and villain took place in the very heart of Ganondorf's castle, where 7 years of tyranny had corrupted even the stones of the ancient fortress into something twisted and malevolent. The battle that raged through the collapsing tower was more than just a contest between two powerful individuals. It was the culmination of cosmic forces that had been building toward this moment since the first conflict between light and darkness. When Princess Zelda finally used her portion of the Triforce to seal Ganondorf away, sending him to whatever punishment awaited those who had abused divine power for selfish ends, the kingdom was finally free to begin the long process of healing from the wounds that 7 years of oppression had inflicted. Yet even in victory, the price of triumph weighed heavily on all who had participated in the struggle, for they understood how close the world had come to falling into eternal darkness. The restoration of peace to Hyrule marked not just the end of one crisis, but the beginning of a new understanding of the responsibilities that came with great power and the vigilance required to prevent such catastrophes from occurring again. The Triforce, reunited once more in the sacred realm, would continue to watch over the kingdom, but its presence would serve as both blessing and warning to future generations about the eternal struggle between the forces of creation and destruction that defines the very nature of existence itself. In the moments that followed Ganondorf's defeat and banishment, when the echoes of battle had faded from the collapsing towers of his fortress and Princess Zelda stood victorious with the power to heal what had been broken, she faced a choice that would reshape not merely her own destiny, but the very fabric of time itself. The Triforce of wisdom that pulsed within her heart carried with it understanding that transcended mortal comprehension, revealing the intricate web of cause and effect that connected all moments across the endless flow of existence. The princess could see with perfect clarity how the victory they had achieved, magnificent though it was, carried within it the seeds of future tragedies that might prove even more devastating than the 7 years of darkness they had just endured. Link's heroic spirit, forged in trials that no child should have been asked to bear, had been shaped by experiences that belonged to his adult self, rather than the youth who had first drawn the Master Sword from its resting place. The young hero standing before her was simultaneously the boy who had grown up in the innocent safety of the Kokiri forest, and the man who had walked through a kingdom transformed by evil. who had witnessed suffering beyond imagination and shouldered responsibilities that would have crushed lesser souls. He was a living paradox, his consciousness holding memories that belonged to different stages of his existence, and this fundamental contradiction threatened to tear his very identity apart. Princess Zelda understood that the only way to heal this wound in the hero's soul was to offer him the chance to live the childhood that had been stolen from him, to return to a time when the weight of destiny had not yet settled upon his shoulders like an iron cloak. The Triforce of Wisdom showed her how this could be accomplished, but it also revealed the terrible price that such mercy would exact upon the timeline itself. To send Link back to his youth would create a fracture in the flow of events, splitting the river of history into multiple streams that would flow in different directions toward divergent destinies. Each possible future would be equally real, equally valid, and each would contain its own unique mixture of triumph and tragedy, hope and despair. The choice to offer such a gift was also the choice to multiply the suffering that would exist across all possible worlds, even as it reduced the burden carried by this particular hero. Yet as the princess gazed into Link's eyes and saw the pain that lurked behind his courageous facade, she knew that mercy was worth any price, no matter how high. With power drawn from the deepest reserves of the Triforce of Wisdom, she began to weave the enchantment that would return the hero to his proper time, sending him back to an age when his greatest concern had been mastering the songs of the forest rather than the arts of war. The magic that flowed through her was unlike anything she had wielded before, touching not merely the physical world but the fundamental structure of reality itself. Time bent and twisted around the chamber where they stood, creating currents and eddies that sparkled with possibilities that had never been explored. The very air seemed to sing with the voices of futures that were being born from the choice she was making, each timeline reaching out to claim its own portion of what had once been a single, unbroken destiny. As Link faded from adult form back to the youth he had been before claiming the Master Sword, the timeline split with the sound of crystal shattering, each fragment carrying its own perfect reflection of all that had been and all that might yet come to pass. The hero of time, as he would be remembered in the songs of future generations, was simultaneously successful and failed, victorious and defeated, depending upon which stream of history one chose to follow. In one timeline, the future that had been prevented by Link's heroic intervention continued to exist as if it had never been challenged, a world where Ganondorf's victory remained absolute, and the forces of light had never found the strength to rise against his tyranny. This was the fallen hero timeline, where courage had proved insufficient and wisdom had come too late, where the kingdom of Hyrule fell into darkness, so complete that only the most desperate measures could preserve even the smallest hope of eventual redemption. The Hyrule of this fallen timeline was a realm transformed by 7 years of Ganondorf's rule into something that bore little resemblance to the peaceful kingdom it had once been. The very landscape had been corrupted by the Demon King's malice, with forests withering into twisted wastelands and rivers running black with substances that poisoned everything they touched. The sky itself seemed dimmer, as if the sun's light was being absorbed by some malevolent force that hungered for the destruction of all things bright and beautiful. In this world, Ganondorf had succeeded in claiming not just the Triforce of Power, but eventually the other two pieces as well, though his possession of the complete sacred relic had transformed both him and it in ways that defied easy understanding. The golden artifact that had once been the pure embodiment of divine will became tainted by the Demon King's malice, its wish-granting power still intact, but now serving only to amplify the destructive desires of its corrupted wielder. The sacred realm, that dimension of perfect harmony, where the Triforce had rested in pristine beauty since the dawn of creation, was transformed into the dark world, a nightmare reflection of everything the goddesses had intended it to be. Where crystal formations had once grown in patterns of mathematical perfection, now twisted spires of corrupted matter reached toward a sky that bled purple light. The pure waters that had flowed through landscapes of transcendent beauty became rivers of malice that carried corruption to every corner of the transformed realm. Ganondorf himself, drunk on absolute power and consumed by malice that had been feeding on his soul for years beyond counting, was no longer truly human in any meaningful sense. He had become Ganon, a creature of pure hatred and destructive appetite, whose very presence was an offense against the natural order. The Demon King's transformation was complete, his original identity subsumed into something that existed only to unmake what others had built and to turn hope into despair wherever it might be found. Yet even in this darkest of all possible timelines, the light was never completely extinguished, for the people of Hyrule possessed a resilience that even absolute tyranny could not entirely crush. In hidden places, in secret chambers deep beneath the earth, and in sanctuaries warded by prayers that had been whispered across generations, the faithful preserved not just their own lives, but the memory of what their kingdom had once been, and the hope that it might someday be restored. The prayers of these hidden survivors reached beyond the boundaries of their corrupted world, calling out to the golden goddesses who had created the Triforce and pleaded for the divine intervention that seemed to be their only remaining hope. The goddesses, who had remained distant from the affairs of mortals since the earliest ages of creation, were moved by suffering so profound that it threatened to tear holes in the very fabric of existence itself. Their response came not in the form of direct intervention, which would have violated the principle of free will that they had woven into the foundations of reality, but through the guidance they offered to a new hero who arose from among the survivors of Ganondorf's tyranny. This Link was not the reincarnation of the hero of time, but a different individual entirely, someone whose courage was born from witnessing the depths to which evil could sink, rather than from innocent determination to protect what was pure and good. The quest that this new hero undertook to claim the corrupted Triforce and restore it to its proper nature was perhaps the most harrowing adventure in all the chronicles of Hyrule's history. He was forced to traverse the dark world that had once been the sacred realm, confronting horrors that would have driven lesser souls to madness, while slowly purifying the sacred relic through his own courage and the faith of those who had never stopped believing that redemption was possible. The battle between this Link and the creature that Ganondorf had become was fought on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, a conflict that raged not just in the physical realm but in the spiritual dimensions where the true nature of good and evil could be directly confronted. When victory was finally achieved and Ganon was destroyed, the wish that Link made upon the restored Triforce was not for personal glory or reward, but for the undoing of all the suffering that the Dark World's existence had caused. The restoration that followed was so complete that it seemed almost to erase the fallen timeline from existence entirely, returning the world to something approaching its original state of peace and prosperity. Yet the scars of what had been endured remained in the hearts of those who remembered, and the knowledge of how close they had come to absolute destruction would influence the choices made by future generations as they faced their own trials and tribulations. In the second timeline that branched away from that moment of choice in Ganondorf's collapsing castle, Link returned to his childhood with full knowledge of what had transpired during his adult years, carrying within his young body the wisdom and experience that had been gained through trials no child should have faced. This was the child timeline, where the hero's warning about Ganondorf's treachery came early enough to prevent the worst catastrophes from occurring, but where new challenges arose from the very success of this early intervention. The young Link, who appeared before the royal court with urgent warnings about the Gerudo King's true intentions, possessed a credibility that his words alone could not have provided, for the Triforce of courage that remained within him served as proof that his claims were more than the fantasies of an imaginative child. Princess Zelda, her own inherited sensitivity to spiritual forces, allowing her to perceive the sacred power that dwelt within the forest youth, recognized immediately that his warnings carried the weight of divine authority. The trial and execution of Ganondorf that followed these revelations sent shockwaves through the political structure of Hyrule, demonstrating that even the most carefully planned treachery could not escape the justice of those who served the light. Yet the Gerudo King's death did not eliminate the threat he represented, for the malice of demise that had been working through him was not so easily destroyed. The ancient evil simply sought out new vessels through which to continue its work of corruption and destruction. The prevention of Ganondorf's rise to power also created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, changing the trajectory of countless lives and altering the balance of forces that shaped events across the known world. Without the 7 years of tyranny to unite them in common cause, the various peoples of Hyrule developed along different paths, their relationships with each other shaped by different challenges and opportunities than those they would have faced in the original timeline. Link, robbed of the trials that would have forged him into the legendary hero of time, found himself struggling with a sense of purposelessness that weighed heavily on his young heart. He possessed memories of incredible adventures and heroic deeds, but in this timeline, those adventures had never occurred and those deeds had never been necessary. He was a hero without a crisis to resolve, a champion without an enemy to face, and the very success of his intervention had made him redundant in ways that no one else could fully understand. The resolution of this internal conflict came when Link was drawn into adventures that had nothing to do with Ganondorf or the Triforce. Journeys that tested his courage and compassion in entirely different ways. The quest that took him to Tamina, that parallel realm where time flowed in cycles and where an entirely different form of evil threatened innocent lives, provided the hero with opportunities to use his abilities in service of others, while also helping him come to terms with the unique nature of his existence. The Majora's Mask crisis, as it came to be known, challenged Link in ways that his memories of facing Ganondorf had not prepared him for, requiring him to develop new forms of courage and new understanding of what it meant to be a hero. The 3-day cycle that trapped Tamina in an endless loop of approaching doom forced the young hero to learn patience and empathy alongside his more conventional fighting skills, as he discovered that some problems could not be solved through combat alone. The friendships that Link forged during his time in Termina, particularly his relationship with the Skull Kid, whose loneliness and pain had made him susceptible to Majora's corrupting influence, taught the hero that redemption was often more powerful than destruction. The lesson that enemies could become friends, and that understanding could triumph over hatred, would serve him well in the challenges that still awaited him in his own world. When Link finally returned to Hyrule, he found a kingdom that was peaceful but not without its own subtle threats, dangers that required a more mature and experienced hero to recognize and address. The Twilight invasion that would eventually threaten the realm was already being prepared by forces that operated in the shadows, entities that had learned caution from observing Ganondorf's spectacular failure. The hero of Twilight, who would eventually arise to face this new threat, would be Link's successor rather than Link himself, though the forest hero's influence on this new champion's development would be profound and lasting. The howling songs that the hero of time's spirit taught to his successor were more than just practical techniques. They were expressions of wisdom gained through experiencing multiple forms of heroism and understanding that courage took many different forms. The third timeline that emerged from Princess Zelda's fateful choice was perhaps the most complex and far-reaching in its implications, For this was the adult timeline, where Link's departure from the world left a vacuum that would eventually be filled by catastrophe beyond imagination. Without the hero of time present to face future crises, Hyrule would be forced to confront the return of ancient evil using only the resources that remained after his disappearance. The Ganondorf, who eventually broke free from the seal that had been placed upon him, found himself in a world where no legendary hero awaited to oppose him, where the traditions of heroism had been allowed to atrophy during the long years of peace that followed the Demon King's initial defeat. The kingdom that had once produced champions capable of standing against ultimate evil now possessed only ordinary warriors whose courage, while admirable, was insufficient to face threats of truly cosmic magnitude. The second war between Ganondorf and the people of Hyrule was even more devastating than the first, for the Demon King had learned from his previous defeat and prepared countermeasures against the tactics that had once brought about his downfall. Without a hero to rally the forces of light and provide the inspiration necessary for impossible victories, the kingdom's resistance crumbled far more quickly than anyone had imagined possible. Princess Zelda, now grown to full maturity and possessed of wisdom earned through years of leadership rather than inherited through reincarnation, recognized that conventional resistance could not succeed against an enemy who had transcended the normal limitations of mortal existence. The only hope for preserving anything of value from the approaching catastrophe lay in desperate measures that would require sacrifices beyond anything that had previously been contemplated. The princess's prayers to the golden goddesses, offered from the depths of despair as Ganondorf's victory became inevitable, received an answer that was both salvation and tragedy in equal measure. The divine beings who had created the Triforce and established the foundations of reality itself would intervene directly in mortal affairs, but the form that their intervention would take would transform the very nature of existence in ways that could never be undone. The great flood that the goddesses sent to cleanse Hyrule of corruption was unlike any natural disaster that had ever been witnessed, for it was powered by divine will rather than mere meteorological forces. The waters that rose to cover the highest mountains and the deepest valleys carried with them the authority of creation itself, washing away not just physical structures but the very memory of the civilization that had once flourished beneath the waves. The Hyrule that disappeared beneath the sacred waters was not merely hidden but transformed, preserved in a state of mystical stasis that removed it from the normal flow of time and change. The kingdom continued to exist beneath the waves, but it existed as a memory rather than a living reality, a monument to what had been lost, and a reminder of the price that came with allowing evil to triumph over good. The survivors of the flood, those few souls who had been chosen to carry on the legacy of the drowned kingdom, found themselves scattered across islands that dotted the vast ocean that had replaced the familiar landscapes of their homeland. These refugees were forced to rebuild their civilization from nothing, creating new traditions and new forms of governance that reflected their transformed circumstances, while also honoring the memory of what had been lost. The hero who eventually arose to challenge Ganondorf in this water world was not Link reborn, but a different individual entirely, a young man whose courage was expressed through exploration and discovery, rather than through traditional combat. The Wind Waker, as he came to be known, faced challenges that were unique to his oceanic environment, while also confronting the same fundamental choice between good and evil that had defined heroism since the beginning of time. The quest that this new Link undertook to reassemble the scattered pieces of the Triforce of Courage tested his determination in ways that differed significantly from the trials faced by previous heroes, requiring him to prove himself worthy, not through combat alone, but through his willingness to preserve hope in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The friendships he formed during his journey, particularly his relationship with the mysterious Tetra, who would eventually be revealed as this timeline's incarnation of Princess Zelda, provided him with the emotional strength necessary to face the final confrontation with ancient evil. The battle between the Hero of Winds and Ganondorf in the drowned throne room of Hyrule Castle was fought not just for the fate of the surface world, but for the right to determine what form the future would take. The Demon King, worn down by centuries of imprisonment and corrupted by malice until little remained of his original identity, represented the past's refusal to accept change and growth. The young hero, by contrast, embodied the potential for renewal and transformation that made progress possible. When Ganondorf was finally defeated and the Master Sword pierced his heart for the last time, his final words carried both acceptance and regret, acknowledging that his dreams of conquest had ultimately brought him nothing but emptiness and despair. The Demon King's death marked not just the end of his personal threat, but the closing of an entire chapter in the history of Good's struggle against evil. The wish that Princess Zelda made upon the completed Triforce in the aftermath of this victory was for hope rather than restoration, for the chance to build something new rather than the return of something old. The waters that had covered Hyrule did not recede, for the kingdom beneath the waves belonged to the past and could not be brought back without also bringing back the conflicts that had destroyed it. Instead, new lands rose from the ocean depths, fresh territories where the survivors could build a different kind of civilization, one that honored the memory of what had been lost, while also embracing the possibilities that the future offered. The new Hyrule that eventually emerged from these efforts was both familiar and strange, carrying forward the best traditions of the Old Kingdom, while also incorporating new ideas and new forms of governance that reflected the lessons learned from witnessing the ultimate consequences of unchecked ambition. The spirit tracks that connected the various regions of New Hyrule were more than just a transportation system. They were physical manifestations of the spiritual bonds that held the new civilization together, channels through which the divine energy that had once been concentrated in the Triforce could flow to bless all who lived under its protection. The train that carried the new link across these sacred rails was itself a symbol of progress and cooperation, representing humanity's ability to harness both ancient wisdom and modern innovation in service of the common good. Each of these three timelines, born from a single moment of compassion and mercy, developed its own unique character and faced its own distinct challenges, yet all remained connected by the fundamental truth that courage, wisdom, and power must be balanced if civilization is to flourish. The heroes who arose in each timeline discovered the same basic principles through their own trials and adventures, learning that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from serving something greater than oneself. The Triforce itself, split across multiple realities but remaining whole in its essential nature, continued to guide and influence events in ways that transcended the boundaries between timelines. The sacred relic's true power lay not in granting wishes, but in inspiring the growth and development that made wish fulfillment possible, teaching each generation to become worthy of the blessings they sought, rather than simply demanding that those blessings be provided without effort or sacrifice. The legacy of the three timelines would echo across countless generations, each reality developing its own traditions and mythologies, while also contributing to a larger understanding of what it meant to live with both freedom and responsibility. The choices made by heroes and villains in each timeline created ripple effects that influenced the development of wisdom and character in ways that could never be fully measured or understood. In the fullness of time, as ages passed and the immediate memory of these cosmic events faded into legend and myth, the deeper truths they represented would be rediscovered by new generations facing their own challenges and making their own choices between light and darkness. The three timelines had proven that reality itself was resilient enough to support multiple expressions of the same fundamental principles, and that hope could flourish even in circumstances that seemed to offer only despair. The Triforce waited patiently in its various forms across all these realities, ready to offer guidance and power to those who proved themselves worthy of such gifts, continuing its eternal mission of helping mortals learn to transcend their limitations and achieve the harmony that the golden goddesses had envisioned when they first brought order out of chaos and life out of emptiness. In the ages that stretched across millennia, between the splitting of the timelines and the convergence of destiny that would eventually reunite them in ways beyond mortal comprehension, there arose in the kingdom of Hyrule a civilization whose achievements would eclipse even the golden ages of the past, yet whose ultimate fate would serve as a sobering reminder that no mortal accomplishment, however magnificent, can endure forever without the wisdom to preserve what has been built through generations of sacrifice and dedication. This was the era when the Sheikah people, those shadow folk who had served the goddess Hylia with unwavering loyalty since the earliest conflicts between light and darkness, reached the pinnacle of their mystical and technological development. No longer content to work from the shadows as guardians and advisors, they emerged into the full light of day to share their accumulated knowledge with the world, believing that the time had come to unite divine wisdom with mortal ingenuity in service of the greater good. The Sheikah of this ancient age possessed understanding that transcended the normal boundaries between magic and science, between the spiritual and the physical, between the possible and the miraculous. Their ancestors had preserved not only the sacred traditions passed down through generations of faithful service, but also fragments of knowledge that dated back to the very creation of the world, insights into the fundamental forces that governed existence itself. These shadow folk had spent countless centuries studying the nature of the Triforce and the divine energy that flowed through all living things, developing techniques that allowed them to harness and channel such power in ways that seemed to blur the line between mortal achievement and godlike ability. Their understanding of what they called force, that vital essence that animated all creation, enabled them to accomplish feats that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. The technology that the Sheikah developed was not the crude manipulation of physical materials that characterized ordinary craftsmanship, but something far more subtle and profound. They learned to infuse their creations with concentrated force, giving them properties that transcended normal limitations and capabilities that seemed to approach the miraculous. Their workshops became temples where the sacred and the practical merged into something entirely new. The most remarkable of their achievements were the autonomous guardians, mechanical constructs that combined the precision of masterful engineering with the wisdom of ancient magical traditions. These spider-like machines were not merely tools, but living expressions of the Sheikah's deepest beliefs about the proper relationship between technology and spirituality, between service and independence, between protection and freedom. Each guardian was individually crafted by master artisans who spent years perfecting every component, every circuit, every mystical inscription that would govern its behavior and define its purpose. These were not mass-produced items, but unique works of art, each one possessing its own personality and its own understanding of the sacred mission it had been created to fulfill. The guardians were designed to be protectors of the innocent, tireless sentinels who would stand watch over the kingdom with patience that measured time in centuries rather than years. The blue light that emanated from their optical sensors was not merely illumination, but a manifestation of the force that flowed through their crystalline cores, a visible symbol of their dedication to the cause of justice and their connection to the divine energy that bound all creation together. Their movements, despite their mechanical nature, possessed a grace that spoke of the spiritual dimension that had been woven into their very existence. The weapons that the Guardians carried were masterpieces of both technological and mystical achievement. Energy beams that could cut through solid stone as easily as sunlight pierces morning mist, yet which were programmed with such precision that they could distinguish between friend and foe with absolute accuracy. These machines were incapable of harming the innocent, their very nature making it impossible for them to be turned against those they had been created to protect. Yet even these remarkable constructs paled in comparison to the true masterpieces of ancient Sheikah engineering, the colossal war machines that would come to be known as the Divine Beasts. These mechanical titans were not merely larger versions of the Guardian design, but entirely different expressions of the same fundamental principles, each one unique in both form and function, each one representing the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge and skill. The Divine Beasts were designed not as weapons of conquest, but as instruments of protection, mobile fortresses that could traverse any terrain and provide support wherever the forces of light might need assistance in their eternal struggle against darkness. Each massive machine was built to honor and represent one of the great races of Hyrule, its form inspired by creatures that held special significance in their respective cultures. Vah Ruta, crafted in the image of an elephant, embodied the wisdom and patience that characterized the Zora people who dwelt in Hyrule's crystal-clear waters. The great machine's trunk could manipulate water with the precision of a master sculptor working in marble, creating barriers of ice or devastating torrents as the situation demanded. Its massive body contained reservoirs that could provide life-sustaining water to communities threatened by drought, while its presence could calm the fiercest storms through technologies that modern minds could barely comprehend. The Divine Beast moved through water with the same grace that characterized the Zora themselves, its mechanical form somehow achieving the fluid elegance that marked all things touched by their aquatic culture. The chambers within Vah Ruta were designed according to architectural principles that reflected the flowing nature of water itself, creating spaces that were both functional and beautiful, practical and inspiring. Vah Medoh soared through the heavens on wings that seemed too delicate to support its massive bulk, yet which carried it aloft with effortless grace that rivaled the flight of the Rito people it had been created to represent. The great bird's aerial capabilities exceeded anything that natural evolution had ever produced, allowing it to reach altitudes where the air was too thin for ordinary creatures to survive, while maintaining perfect control and maneuverability at any speed. From its lofty perch among the clouds, Vah Medoh could survey vast territories with sensors that missed no detail of the landscape below, its vigilant watch ensuring that no threat could approach the kingdom undetected. The Divine Beast's weapons were designed for precision rather than raw destruction, capable of striking specific targets from incredible distances without causing unnecessary damage to the surrounding area. In the volcanic regions where the Goron people made their homes among the lava flows and mineral-rich caverns, Vah Rudania scuttled across molten rock with the sure-footed confidence of its salamander design. The great machine's heat-resistant armor allowed it to operate in environments that would destroy ordinary mechanisms, while its internal systems could harness geothermal energy to power abilities that seemed to border on the supernatural. Vah Rudania's presence could calm volcanic eruptions through techniques that involved harmonizing with the natural forces that drove such phenomena, transforming potentially destructive energy into beneficial power that could serve the needs of civilization. The Divine Beast's chambers were designed to withstand temperatures that would melt ordinary metals, creating a mobile forge where the finest weapons and tools could be crafted even in the midst of battle. across the vast expanses of desert sand where the Gerudo people had built their fortress cities. Varnaboris stalked like a great camel, perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of its environment. The divine beast's broad feet distributed its enormous weight across the shifting dunes, allowing it to traverse terrain that would bog down smaller machines, while its hump contained the sophisticated electrical generators that powered its most devastating abilities. The great machine could summon lightning from clear skies, directing electrical storms with precision that surpassed even the most skilled weather workers among the Gerudo tribe. Yet this awesome power was always controlled and directed, never unleashed in wild fury, but channeled according to the wisdom and compassion that had guided its creation. Varnaboris could bring life-giving rain to drought-stricken regions as easily as it could call down divine judgment upon those who threatened the innocent. The pilots who would eventually be chosen to command these mechanical marvels were selected not merely for their combat skills or their tactical knowledge, but for their embodiment of the spiritual qualities that the divine beasts represented. Each champion needed to demonstrate not only the technical competence necessary to operate such complex machines, but also the moral character required to wield such power responsibly. The selection process was itself a sacred ritual that involved tests of both ability and integrity, challenges that revealed the candidate's deepest nature and their worthiness to serve as the living connection between mortal wisdom and divine power. Those who proved themselves suitable for such responsibility underwent training that lasted for years, learning not just the practical skills they would need, but also the philosophical principles that would guide their decisions in times of crisis. The bond between each champion and their divine beast was more than a simple matter of pilot and machine. It was a spiritual partnership that united mortal consciousness with the crystallized wisdom of the ancient Sheikah. The great machines responded to their pilot's thoughts and emotions as much as to their physical commands, creating a synthesis of mortal intuition and mechanical precision that exceeded what either could achieve alone. The network of Sheikah towers that rose from strategic locations across the kingdom served as both communication system and early warning network, their crystalline spires reaching toward the heavens like fingers stretched in prayer. The society that grew up around these technological marvels was one where the artificial and the natural, the mechanical and the organic, the sacred and the practical, existed in harmonious balance. Cities were planned according to principles that honored both functional efficiency and aesthetic beauty, while agricultural systems integrated Shika innovations with traditional farming methods that had been refined across countless generations. The education of the young incorporated both technical training and spiritual development, ensuring that each new generation would possess not only the skills necessary to maintain the complex systems their ancestors had created, but also the wisdom required to use such power responsibly. The schools and academies of this era were centers of learning that approached knowledge as a sacred trust rather than mere information to be accumulated and exploited. Yet even as this remarkable civilization reached heights of achievement that seemed to approach the divine, there were those among the Shika who began to question whether their pursuit of perfection might be leading them away from, rather than toward their original purposes. These voices of caution warned that the line between serving others and controlling them was thinner than their people might wish to acknowledge, and that power, no matter how benevolently intended, carried within it the seeds of its own corruption. The debates that arose within Shika society over these fundamental questions were conducted with the same rigor and careful analysis that characterized all their endeavors. Yet they also revealed deep philosophical divisions that had been growing for generations. Some believed that their advanced capabilities gave them both the right and the obligation to guide the development of other peoples, while others maintained that true service required them to remain in supporting roles rather than assuming leadership positions. These internal tensions remained largely philosophical until the day when ancient prophecies began to manifest in ways that could no longer be dismissed as mere superstition or metaphorical teachings. The signs were subtle at first, disturbances in the mystical networks that connected the shrines and towers, anomalies in the behavior of force that flowed through all their creations, a growing sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of reality itself. The prophets and seers among the Shika recognized these disturbances as harbingers of the return of Calamity Ganon, that ancient evil which had plagued the world in ages past and which had been sealed away but never truly destroyed. The malice that had corrupted Ganondorf centuries earlier was stirring once more, gathering strength for another attempt to claim the power of the Triforce and reshape the world according to its vision of perfect destruction. The preparations that the Shika began for this approaching crisis drew upon every resource at their disposal, every innovation they had developed, every alliance they had cultivated across the long years of peace and prosperity. They understood that the coming conflict would test not only their technological achievements but also the spiritual foundations upon which their entire civilization had been built. The plan they developed was elegantly simple in concept yet staggeringly complex in execution, requiring precise coordination between multiple elements across vast distances and extended time periods. The divine beasts would serve as mobile command centers for the defense of the kingdom, while the guardians would form an autonomous army capable of responding to threats faster than any conventional military force. Most crucially, the ancient machines would work in coordination with the chosen heroes of the age, mortal champions whose courage and wisdom would provide the spiritual guidance necessary to ensure that technological might serve the cause of justice rather than domination. The Shika had learned from studying the histories of earlier ages that victory over ultimate evil required more than superior weapons or tactical advantages. It demanded the kind of moral clarity that could only come from hearts that had chosen good over evil, despite the personal costs such choices might entail. When Calamity Ganon finally emerged from whatever dark realm had contained it, rising from beneath Hyrule Castle like a plague given physical form, the ancient Sheikah technology responded exactly as its creators had intended. The Guardians emerged from their hidden storage facilities, their blue lights blazing with righteous purpose as they moved to engage the forces of corruption. The divine beasts took their positions at strategic locations around the kingdom, their massive weapons charging with power that seemed to draw upon the fundamental forces of creation itself. The battle that followed was unlike anything the world had witnessed since the original conflict between the goddess Hylia and the demon lord Demise, a contest between the accumulated wisdom of ages and the concentrated malice of ultimate evil. The very landscape trembled under the impact of energies that transcended normal physical laws, while the sky burned with lights that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. Yet even as the forces of light achieved victories that seemed to herald ultimate triumph, even as the ancient machines performed beyond their creators' most optimistic expectations, the true test of their civilization was yet to come. The success of their technology in battle would prove less significant than the wisdom they had cultivated for using such success responsibly, and the greatest challenges they would face would come not from external enemies, but from the choices made by those they had trusted to guide them toward a better future. The victory over Calamity Ganon that seemed so complete and decisive in its immediate aftermath would eventually reveal itself to be merely the first movement in a longer and more complex symphony of triumph and tragedy, wisdom gained and innocence lost, power achieved and responsibility discovered. The ancient Sheikah had built wonders that would endure for millennia, but they had also set in motion forces that would ultimately test whether mortals could ever truly master the art of wielding divine power without being corrupted by the very gifts they sought to use for the benefit of all. In the centuries that flowed like gentle streams through the accumulated wisdom of ages, when the ancient Sheikah technology lay buried beneath layers of earth, and deliberate forgetting and the memories of mechanical marvels had faded into half-remembered legends whispered around evening fires, the kingdom of Hyrule entered a new phase of its eternal cycle. This was an era when the very success of past victories had created the conditions for future tragedies, when the peace that had been purchased through the sacrifice of heroes became the foundation for complacency that would prove nearly fatal to all who called this blessed realm their home. The Triforce, that sacred relic which had shaped the destiny of nations and individuals across countless generations, remained as potent as ever in its influence upon the world, yet its presence had become so subtle and pervasive that few among the living could recognize its touch upon their daily lives. Like sunlight that nourishes growing things without drawing attention to its own vital importance, the divine artifact continued to weave its golden threads through the tapestry of existence, guiding events toward outcomes that served the greater good, even when those involved could not perceive the deeper patterns at work. In the royal bloodline of Hyrule, the sacred power that had been passed down through generations of princesses had taken on new forms and new names, its true nature obscured by the passage of time and the gradual transformation of ancient knowledge into ritualized tradition. What had once been understood as a direct connection to the Triforce itself had become known as the sealing power, a mystical ability that manifested differently in each generation, but always carried within it the potential for miracles that transcended normal mortal capabilities. Princess Zelda, who would prove to be perhaps the most crucial figure in all the long history of this power, grew up in a kingdom that had forgotten more than it remembered about its own spiritual heritage. The ceremonies and prayers that had once been performed with full understanding of their cosmic significance had become empty rituals carried out from habit rather than comprehension, while the true meaning of the symbols and traditions that surrounded the royal family had been lost to all but the most dedicated scholars. The young princess found herself in the paradoxical position of being the inheritor of power beyond imagination while lacking access to the knowledge that would allow her to understand or control what flowed through her veins. The death of her mother, that wise queen who might have served as guide and teacher in the mystical arts, left Zelda orphaned not just from parental love, but from the feminine wisdom that had been transmitted from mother to daughter across countless generations. King Rome, though a ruler of exceptional wisdom and dedication, could offer his daughter guidance in matters of statecraft and diplomacy, but found himself helpless when faced with questions that touched upon the deeper mysteries of her inherited abilities. The traditions of the royal court had preserved the forms and ceremonies associated with the sealing power, but the substance and understanding that gave those rituals their true meaning had been allowed to slip away like water through fingers that cannot grasp what they most desperately need to hold. The priests and scholars who served in the royal court had access to ancient texts that spoke of the sealing power in terms that seemed both profound and frustratingly vague, describing abilities that transcended normal understanding, while offering little practical guidance about how such abilities might be awakened or controlled. Their knowledge was like a beautiful tapestry that had been partially unraveled by time, with enough of the original pattern remaining to suggest its former glory while lacking the crucial threads that would have made the whole design comprehensible. Princess Zelda's struggle to awaken her dormant abilities became the defining challenge of her youth, a source of frustration and self-doubt that colored every aspect of her development from curious child to responsible adult. She followed the prescribed rituals with meticulous care, visiting the ancient springs that had been built in ages past to honor the goddesses, offering prayers that had been refined through countless generations of faithful observance, yet always the result was the same crushing disappointment as the power within her remained stubbornly dormant. The springs of power, courage, and wisdom that marked the sacred geography of Hyrule had been maintained across the centuries by devoted caretakers who understood their importance even when they could no longer fully comprehend the principles that made such importance meaningful. These holy sites retained their mystical properties, their waters still carrying traces of the divine energy that had been concentrated there in ages past. Yet, without proper understanding of how to approach such forces, even the most sincere supplicant might find themselves unable to access the blessings that waited within reach. The princess's efforts to unlock her inheritance were complicated by the pressure of expectation that surrounded her from every direction. The ancient prophecies spoke of a time when darkness would return to threaten the world, when the sealing power would be desperately needed to prevent catastrophe beyond imagination. Yet they provided no clear guidance about when such a crisis might arrive, or what form it might take when it finally manifested. The scholarly advisors who studied these prophecies with the dedication of lifetime devotion found themselves caught between their desire to offer helpful guidance and their honest acknowledgement that much of what they studied remained beyond their comprehension. They could translate the ancient texts with reasonable accuracy, could parse the grammar and vocabulary of languages that had not been spoken for centuries. Yet the deeper meanings embedded in metaphor and symbol often eluded their most careful analysis. As the years of Zelda's youth passed without any sign that her powers were awakening, the pressure she felt from her own expectations and those of others began to take a toll that extended far beyond mere frustration or disappointment. The princess began to question not just her own worthiness, but the validity of the entire system of belief and tradition that surrounded her family's role in the cosmic order, wondering if perhaps the old stories were nothing more than comforting myths that had been preserved long past their useful lifetime. This crisis of faith was deepened by her natural inclination towards scholarly pursuits and rational analysis, intellectual gifts that served her well in most areas of study, but which sometimes created obstacles when dealing with matters that transcended purely logical understanding. The princess's keen mind insisted on seeking explanations and evidence, patterns and principles that could be analyzed and understood, yet the mystical realm operated according to different rules that often seemed to contradict everything that reason suggested should be true. The tension between her rational nature and the mystical heritage she was supposed to inherit created internal conflicts that further complicated her efforts to access the sealing power that flowed through her bloodline. The very intensity of her desire to understand and control her abilities may have become an obstacle to their natural expression, like someone trying so hard to fall asleep that their effort itself prevents the relaxation that would make sleep possible. Meanwhile, in the depths beneath Hyrule Castle, where ancient seals had contained malevolent forces for millennia beyond counting, something stirred in the darkness with the patient inevitability of geological processes that measure time in eras rather than years. The malice that had been bound there since the great victory 10,000 years past had not been destroyed by that triumph, but only contained, like fire banked beneath ash that waits for the proper conditions to flare back into devastating life. Calamity Ganon, as this ancient evil had come to be known, represented something far more dangerous than any conventional enemy, for its essence transcended the normal limitations that bound even the most powerful mortal beings. This was hatred, distilled into its purest form, destructive appetite given shape and purpose, the fundamental force of entropy that seeks to return all creation to the void from which it originally emerged. The cycles that governed the calamity's return were as precise and predictable as the movements of celestial bodies, yet they operated on timescales that made them difficult for mortal beings to perceive or prepare for adequately. Each manifestation was separated by exactly 10,000 years, a span of time so vast that multiple civilizations could rise and fall in the intervals between appearances, ensuring that direct memory of previous encounters would fade into legend and legend into myth before the next crisis arrived. The approach of the centennial anniversary of the calamity's expected return began to manifest in signs that were subtle at first. Disturbances in the natural order that might have been dismissed as coincidence by those who lacked the sensitivity to perceive deeper patterns. Scholars who devoted their lives to studying ancient lore noted anomalies in weather patterns that seemed to echo descriptions found in the oldest texts, while those sensitive to mystical influences reported dreams and visions that carried echoes of warnings from ages past. The fortune teller, whose prophecy would finally galvanize the kingdom into action, was a figure whose reputation for accuracy in matters both mundane and mystical had earned her access to the highest levels of the royal court. Her predictions about smaller matters had proven correct with sufficient frequency that even skeptics were forced to acknowledge that she possessed insights that transcended normal mortal perception, making her warnings about cosmic threats impossible to dismiss as mere superstition or attention-seeking. The prophecy she delivered spoke of darkness rising once again from the depths where it had been contained, of ancient evil awakening with hunger sharpened by millennia of imprisonment, of destruction that would surpass anything the kingdom had previously endured, unless preparation began immediately. Most significantly, she warned that this time the calamity would be different, having learned from its previous defeats and evolved new strategies that might prove impossible to counter using the same methods that had succeeded in ages past. King Rome's response to these dire warnings demonstrated the wisdom and courage that had made him one of Hyrule's most beloved rulers, for he understood that leadership sometimes required making difficult decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. The prophecy might prove false, the preparations might prove unnecessary, but the consequences of ignoring legitimate warnings about existential threats were too severe to contemplate. The excavation projects that began under royal decree represented one of the most ambitious archaeological undertakings in the kingdom's history, requiring the coordination of scholars, engineers, laborers, and mystics in a massive effort to uncover technologies that had been deliberately buried and forgotten. The locations where the ancient machines rested were known only through fragmentary records and half-remembered legends, making the search process as much an exercise in detective work as in practical archaeology. The Sheikah researchers who led these efforts brought to the task not only their people's traditional expertise in matters mystical and technological, but also a deep understanding of their ancestors' methods and priorities. Pura and Robbie, whose names would become legendary for their contributions to this crucial work, represented the finest tradition of Sheikah scholarship, combining rigorous intellectual discipline with the intuitive insights that came from generations of faithful service to the goddess and her chosen representatives. The discovery of the first divine beast sent shockwaves through both the scholarly community and the general population, for here was tangible proof that the ancient legends contained more truth than poetry. Vah-Ruta, emerging from its earthen tomb near Zora's domain like a mechanical leviathan awakening from eons of slumber, demonstrated craftsmanship and engineering principles that exceeded anything the current age had produced. Yet its design was unmistakably created by minds that had understood principles modern scholars were only beginning to rediscover. The process of bringing the ancient machines back to operational status required not just technical skill, but also a kind of spiritual archaeology, as the researchers worked to understand not only how the divine beasts functioned, but why they had been created and what principles had guided their original designers. Each system they activated, each function they restored, revealed new layers of complexity that spoke of a civilization whose achievements had been built upon foundations of wisdom as well as knowledge. The guardians that were discovered alongside the divine beasts presented their own unique challenges and opportunities. For these smaller but more numerous machines represented a form of autonomous defense system that could theoretically protect the entire kingdom without requiring human operators. The spider-like constructs had been designed to operate independently while remaining absolutely loyal to their programming, creating an army that would never tire, never retreat, and never betray the trust placed in them. The restoration of both divine beasts and guardians required not only technical expertise, but also the kind of spiritual sensitivity that would allow modern operators to interface successfully with technologies that had been designed to respond to consciousness as much as to mechanical commands. The ancient Sheikah had created their machines to be partners rather than mere tools, meaning that successful operation required a degree of harmony between pilot and machine that went far beyond simple technical competence. As the excavation projects continued, and more of the ancient technology was brought back to functional status, it became clear that the kingdom would need not just machines but also individuals capable of operating them effectively when the crisis finally arrived. The selection of champions to pilot the divine beasts became a matter of crucial importance, requiring candidates who possessed not only exceptional combat skills but also the spiritual qualities necessary to form effective partnerships with machines that had been designed to respond to the deepest aspects of their operators' poleness. Personalities. Princess Zelda herself took an active role in the champion selection process, drawing upon insights that came from sources she could not fully articulate, but which seemed to guide her toward individuals whose character and capabilities made them ideal for the responsibilities they would assume. Her choices reflected not just practical considerations about combat effectiveness, but also deeper intuitions about the kind of people who could be trusted with power of such magnitude. Mipha, the Zora princess whose grace and wisdom had made her beloved among her people, brought to her role as pilot of Varuta not just exceptional skill with her traditional weapon, but also healing abilities that seemed to draw upon the same mystical sources that powered the ancient machines. Her natural empathy and compassion made her an ideal interface for a divine beast whose original purpose had been to nurture and protect rather than simply to destroy. Daruk, the Goron chief, whose strength was matched only by his gentle heart, proved capable of forming an almost familial bond with Varudania that allowed him to operate the great salamander with an intuitive understanding that transcended mere technical knowledge. His natural protective instincts aligned perfectly with the divine beast's defensive capabilities, creating a partnership that exemplified the harmony between mortal wisdom and ancient engineering. Revali, the Rito warrior whose mastery of aerial combat was legendary even among his flight-capable people, brought to his partnership with Var Meadow a combination of tactical brilliance and aerial expertise that allowed the great bird to achieve its full potential as both reconnaissance platform and flying fortress. His pride and competitiveness, while sometimes difficult for others to endure, provided the driving force necessary to push both pilot and machine to levels of performance that exceeded their individual capabilities. Urbosa, the Gerudo chief, whose strength and wisdom had made her a legend among the warrior women of the desert, formed with Varna Boris a partnership that seemed to embody the very essence of divine judgment, tempered by maternal compassion. Her ability to command lightning reflected not just her mastery of elemental forces, but also her understanding of the balance between power and responsibility that defined truly effective leadership. The fifth champion, Link, presented a unique case that required special consideration, for his role would differ fundamentally from that of the Divine Beast pilots. The young Hylian's destiny was tied not to any single machine but to the Master Sword itself, that legendary blade which had been waiting in the depths of the sacred forest for a hero worthy of its sacred trust. Link's ability to claim the Master Sword demonstrated that he possessed not just exceptional combat skills, but also the spiritual purity necessary to wield a weapon that had been forged from the essence of the goddess herself. The sword's acceptance of him as its chosen bearer marked him as the prophesied hero whose courage would be crucial to the success of their entire enterprise. The appointment of Link as Princess Zelda's personal knight created a complex dynamic between two individuals whose destinies were intertwined in ways that neither fully understood. The princess saw in the young warrior a living reminder of her own failure to awaken the powers she had inherited, while Link found himself struggling to understand his role in supporting someone whose abilities seemed to dwarf his own despite her inability to access them. The relationship between Princess Zelda and her appointed knight was further complicated by the weight of expectation that surrounded them both, the knowledge that the fate of the kingdom might depend upon their ability to work together effectively when the ultimate crisis arrived. Neither had asked for the responsibilities that had been placed upon their shoulders, yet both understood that duty and honor demanded they accept whatever burdens fate had chosen to give them. The years of preparation that preceded the calamity's return were marked by a growing sense of anticipation that affected everyone involved in the defensive preparations. The champions trained together, learning to coordinate their abilities and developing the personal bonds that would be crucial when they faced their ultimate test. The ancient machines were restored to full operational status and positioned at strategic locations around the kingdom, while the Guardian army was deployed to protect the most vulnerable areas from attack. Yet even as these preparations proceeded with meticulous care and attention to detail, there were those among the wise who wondered whether the kingdom might be placing too much faith in technologies that had been created in a different age to face different challenges. The calamity that was approaching had been imprisoned for 10,000 years, time enough for even the most ancient evil to learn and adapt, to study the methods that had been used against it, and develop countermeasures that might prove devastatingly effective. These concerns proved to be tragically prophetic when Calamity Ganon finally emerged from its prison beneath Hyrule Castle, for the ancient evil had indeed spent its long imprisonment learning about the weapons that had been used to defeat it. The malice that poured forth from the depths carried with it a corrupting influence that transformed the kingdom's greatest strengths into its most dangerous vulnerabilities. The guardians that had been positioned throughout Hyrule as autonomous protectors became instruments of destruction as their optical sensors shifted from the peaceful blue of their intended function to the malevolent purple of corruption. The very efficiency and autonomy that had made them such effective defenders now made them perfect instruments of terror, for they knew the kingdom's defenses intimately and could strike at targets that conventional enemies would never have been able to identify. The divine beasts, those magnificent machines that had been prepared as mobile command centers for the defense of the realm, fell under similar corruption as malevolent entities seized control of their systems and turned their awesome power against the very people they had been designed to protect. The champions who rushed to their mechanical partners found themselves facing not allies but enemies, trapped within the confines of machines that had become prisons commanded by creatures specifically designed to counter their particular strengths and abilities. The tragedy that unfolded as each champion fell to their designated tormentor represented not just the loss of exceptional individuals, but the destruction of hope itself. These were the heroes who had been chosen through careful selection and years of training. Individuals who had proven themselves worthy of wielding power that transcended normal mortal limitations, yet they were overwhelmed by enemies that had been crafted specifically to exploit their weaknesses and turn their strengths against them. Mipha's compassion and healing abilities became liabilities when facing an opponent that fed on the very life force she sought to preserve and protect. Daruk's protective instincts were turned against him by an enemy that could use his concern for others as a weapon to distract and weaken him. Rivali's pride and confidence became vulnerabilities that his tormentor exploited with ruthless precision, while Urbosa's strength and wisdom proved insufficient against an opponent that had been designed to counter every strategy she might employ. The fall of the champions marked the beginning of the kingdom's darkest hour, as the ancient machines that should have been its salvation became instruments of its destruction. The very success of the ancient Sheikah in creating technologies that could operate autonomously now worked against their successors, for the corrupted machines required no human support or guidance to carry out their work of devastation. In the chaos that engulfed Hyrule Castle as Calamity Ganon broke free from its prison, King Rome faced the ultimate test of his courage and dedication as a ruler. The wise king who had guided his people through years of peace and prosperity now found himself confronting a crisis that exceeded anything in the kingdom's recorded history. Yet he met this challenge with the same steady determination that had characterized his entire reign. The king's death in the defense of his realm represented not just personal tragedy, but the collapse of the political and social structures that had maintained order and stability for generations. With the royal court scattered or destroyed and the capital city in flames, the carefully organized resistance that had been planned for years dissolved into chaos as individual communities found themselves forced to fend for themselves against enemies they had never imagined facing. Princess Zelda and Link, fleeing from the ruins of their carefully laid plans, found themselves in the paradoxical position of being both the kingdom's last hope and its most hunted fugitives. The failure of everything they had worked toward weighed heavily upon them both, yet they pressed forward with the stubborn determination that characterizes true heroes even in their darkest moments. The running battle that carried them across the length and breadth of Hyrule tested not just their physical capabilities, but also their emotional resilience, as they witnessed firsthand the destruction of everything they had sworn to protect. Villages that had known only peace for generations were reduced to ash and rubble, while innocent people who had trusted in the kingdom's protection fell victim to machines that had been created to serve as their guardians. Link's heroic efforts to protect both the princess and any survivors they encountered during their flight demonstrated the same courage and selflessness that had marked him as worthy of the Master Sword. Yet even his legendary abilities had limits. The continuous fighting against overwhelming odds gradually wore down his strength and damaged his equipment, while the weight of responsibility for protecting someone whose abilities remained frustratingly dormant added psychological stress to his physical exhaustion. The Master Sword itself, that legendary blade forged from divine essence and tempered in the fires of righteous purpose, began to show signs of strain under the impossible demands placed upon it. The continuous battle against enemies that embodied pure corruption gradually wore away at the blade's sacred nature, causing hairline cracks to appear in metal that should have been unbreakable, and dulling an edge that should have remained eternally sharp. At Ash Swamp, in a location whose very name seemed to prophesy the desolation that had overtaken the kingdom, the accumulated stresses finally took their toll on the hero who had carried so much for so long. Link's collapse was not just physical exhaustion, but a complete failure of the systems that had sustained him through impossible challenges. The inevitable result of pushing mortal flesh and spirit beyond the limits of what any individual should be asked to endure. The sight of her appointed knight falling before her eyes, struck down while defending her from enemies that her own failure had made possible, finally provided Princess Zelda with the catalyst needed to unlock the power that had remained dormant within her throughout all the years of struggle and frustration. The love and desperation she felt in that moment of ultimate crisis created the emotional conditions necessary for the Triforce to finally manifest through her consciousness. The golden light that erupted from Princess Zelda as her sealing power finally awakened was more than mere magical energy. It was the concentrated essence of the Triforce itself, channeled through a mortal consciousness that had been prepared through years of dedication and purified through the crucible of absolute loss. The sacred triangles that appeared upon her hand were not symbols, but the actual manifestation of divine power in its most concentrated form. The wave of purifying energy that swept across the battlefield with the force of divine judgment stripped the corrupting malice from every guardian it touched, returning the ancient machines to their original purpose, as protectors rather than destroyers. The sight of their optical sensors shifting from malevolent purple back to peaceful blue marked not just a tactical victory, but a spiritual triumph over the forces that sought to pervert noble purposes into instruments of evil. Yet even this miraculous intervention came too late to save the kingdom from devastation or to restore the lives that had been lost during the hours of chaos and destruction. The champions remained dead, their divine beasts corrupted, and vast areas of Hyrule transformed into wastelands that would require generations to heal. The victory was real but incomplete, a demonstration of power sufficient to prevent total annihilation but inadequate to undo the damage that had already been done. Princess Zelda's decision to place the mortally wounded Link in the Shrine of Resurrection represented both an act of mercy and a strategic gamble that would span an entire century. The ancient Sheikah technology could preserve his life and heal his wounds, but at the cost of the memories that defined his identity and the relationships that had given meaning to his existence. The hero who would eventually emerge would possess his skills and courage, but would need to rediscover everything else that had made him who he was. The princess's own sacrifice, walking alone into the ruins of Hyrule Castle to confront Calamity Ganon in its seat of power, demonstrated the same selfless courage that had characterized all the heroes of her lineage. Armed with nothing but the sealing power she had finally mastered and the determination to protect what remained of her people, she entered into a contest of wills with an enemy whose malice had been accumulating for millennia. The seal that Princess Zelda created around Calamity Ganon was not a prison in any conventional sense, but a continuous battle of spiritual forces that would endure for exactly as long as her will remained unbroken. For 100 years, she would hold the ancient evil in check through nothing more than her own determination and the divine power that flowed through her, preventing it from completing its work of destruction, while also preventing it from being destroyed permanently. This century-long vigil represented the ultimate expression of the sealing power's true nature, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a force of preservation and protection that could maintain hope even in circumstances that seemed to offer none. The princess, who had once doubted her own worthiness, had become the living embodiment of everything the Triforce represented, using power, wisdom, and courage in perfect harmony to serve something greater than her own desires or needs. The kingdom that would emerge from this century of stalemate would be scarred but not broken, transformed but not destroyed, ready to begin the long journey back toward the light, when the hero finally awakened to complete what they had started together in that moment of desperate triumph, when love proved stronger than hate and hope proved more enduring than despair. In the years that followed the Great Awakening and the defeat of Calamity Ganon, when the hero Link had emerged from his century-long slumber to restore the divine beasts and free the champion's spirits from their torment, the Kingdom of Hyrule began the long and difficult process of healing from wounds that had cut deeper than anyone fully understood. The victory that had seemed so complete and decisive when the Calamity's malice was finally purged from Hyrule Castle would prove to be merely the first movement in a larger symphony of restoration and discovery that would unfold across the generations to come. Princess Zelda, freed at last from her century-long battle of wills with ancient evil, found herself in the peculiar position of being both a survivor of the old world and a stranger to the new one that had grown up around her absence. The kingdom she remembered from her youth existed now only in ruins and memories, while the communities that had survived the century of her imprisonment had developed their own traditions and ways of life that reflected their unique experiences of loss and adaptation. The work of rebuilding that stretched ahead seemed almost as daunting as the battles they had fought to make such rebuilding possible, for it would require not just the reconstruction of physical structures, but the weaving together of social bonds that had been severed by catastrophe and the passage of time. The various peoples of Hyrule had maintained their essential character and their basic loyalty to the ideals that had once united them, yet they had also changed in ways that would require careful navigation and patient understanding. Link, meanwhile, faced the challenge of recovering not just his memories, but his sense of purpose, in a world that no longer needed a champion to stand against ultimate evil. The hero who had proven himself capable of facing any challenge, of overcoming any obstacle through courage and determination, now found himself confronting the more subtle but equally important task of helping to create something new rather than simply defending what already existed. The relationship between the princess and the hero, tested by shared trials and deepened by mutual sacrifice, became the foundation upon which much of the kingdom's renewal would be built. Their partnership represented not just personal affection, but a symbolic union between the wisdom that preserved ancient knowledge and the courage that was willing to venture into unknown territories, between the power that could reshape reality and the compassion that ensured such power would be used responsibly. Yet even as Hyrule began to flourish once more under their guidance, strange phenomena began to manifest in ways that suggested the cosmic drama they had lived through was far from complete. The very success of their efforts to restore balance and harmony seemed to have unlocked new possibilities that had been dormant during the century of conflict and imprisonment, forces that operated according to principles that transcended the familiar patterns of good and evil, light and darkness. The first signs of these emerging mysteries appeared in the skies above Hyrule, where islands of living stone began to rise from the earth as if drawn upward by invisible hands. These floating landmasses defied every known law of nature, maintaining their position in the heavens through means that no scholar could explain, and displaying properties that seemed to bridge the gap between the physical and the mystical in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the broader nature of reality itself. The upheaval, as this phenomenon came to be known, transformed not just the landscape, but the very concept of what was possible within the boundaries of mortal existence. Ancient ruins that had lain buried for millennia suddenly thrust themselves toward the sky, while new formations of crystal and metal appeared in configurations that spoke of intelligence and purpose beyond anything that natural processes could have produced. Princess Zelda, whose scholarly instincts had always driven her to seek understanding of the mysteries that surrounded her heritage, found herself drawn to investigate these anomalies with the same intensity she had once brought to unlocking her sealing power. The symbols and structures that appeared throughout the transformed landscape carried echoes of civilizations even older than the ancient Sheikah, suggestions of knowledge and capabilities that predated everything she thought she knew about Hyrule's history. The most intriguing of these discoveries were the ruins that bore the distinctive spiral patterns and dragon motifs that characterized the work of the Zonai, that mysterious people who had vanished from history so completely that even their name existed only in the most obscure fragments of ancient lore. The architecture they had left behind suggested a civilization that had achieved harmony between technology and nature in ways that surpassed even the greatest accomplishments of later ages. The Zonai constructs that began to emerge from hidden chambers and sealed vaults demonstrated engineering principles that seemed to operate according to different rules than those that governed ordinary matter and energy. These devices could manipulate gravity itself, creating vehicles that moved through the air with effortless grace while carrying loads that should have been impossible for their apparent size and structure to support. More mysterious still were the energy sources that powered these ancient mechanisms, crystalline formations that seemed to draw their power from the fundamental forces that bound reality together. The examination of these power cells revealed patterns of energy flow that resembled nothing so much as the mystical networks that connected the shrines and towers of Sheikah construction, suggesting connections between civilizations that had been separated by vast gulfs of time. Link's natural curiosity and his hard-won expertise in dealing with ancient technologies made him an ideal partner in Princess Zelda's investigations, though the challenges they encountered in exploring the transformed landscape required new applications of skills he had developed during his previous adventures. The floating islands could be reached only through careful use of the gliding techniques he had mastered, while the puzzles they contained demanded not just physical dexterity, but creative thinking about how different elements could be combined to achieve desired results. The ability to fuse objects together using principles that the Zonai had apparently mastered thousands of years earlier opened up possibilities for problem-solving that went far beyond anything Link had encountered in his previous adventures. Weapons could be enhanced with properties borrowed from other materials. Vehicles could be constructed from components that had never been designed to work together, and obstacles could be overcome through combinations of resources that transformed limitation into opportunity. This power to unite disparate elements into functional wholes seemed to reflect deeper principles that govern the relationship between creativity and discovery, between innovation and tradition. The ancient Zonai had apparently understood that true progress came not from discarding what had been learned by previous generations, but from finding new ways to combine existing knowledge with fresh insights and novel approaches. Yet even as Link and Princess Zelda worked together to uncover the secrets of the upheaval and the civilization that had apparently triggered it, darker forces were stirring in the depths beneath Hyrule Castle. The defeat of Calamity Ganon had not eliminated the source of ancient malice, but had only removed one manifestation of hatred that transcended mortal understanding. And now that fundamental evil was seeking new forms and new opportunities to continue its eternal war against creation itself, the mummified remains that had been discovered in the deepest chambers beneath the castle represented not just archaeological curiosity but active threat for the consciousness that had once inhabited. That preserved form had not departed with the destruction of its more recent incarnation. Ganondorf, the Gerudo king who had been the original vessel for Demise's hatred, had endured in a state that was neither true death nor genuine life, sustained by malice so concentrated that it had taken on properties approaching the divine. The awakening of this ancient evil coincided with Princess Zelda's investigations in ways that were not coincidental, for the same cosmic forces that had triggered the upheaval and revealed the Zonai ruins had also disturbed seals and barriers that had contained threats beyond mortal comprehension. The princess's encounter with the mummified Ganondorf in those deep chambers would have consequences that extended far beyond her own fate, setting in motion events that would test everything she and Link had learned about courage, wisdom, and the responsible use of power. The strange stone that attached itself to Link's right arm during that fateful exploration was not merely an artifact but a living connection to forces that operated outside the normal flow of time and causality. This construct, apparently created by Zonai technology in ages past, granted abilities that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of mortal flesh, allowing its bearer to manipulate the world in ways that bordered on the miraculous. The fusibility that Link discovered he possessed through this mysterious enhancement reflected the same principles that had apparently guided Zonai civilization in its approach to harmony between different elements of existence. Just as their society had apparently found ways to unite technology with nature, innovation with tradition, so too could their constructs unite disparate objects into new forms that exceeded the capabilities of their component parts. The Ascend power demonstrated even more dramatically how Zonai understanding had transcended conventional assumptions about the relationship between matter and space, allowing its user to pass through solid barriers as if they were merely suggestions rather than absolute limitations. This ability suggested a comprehension of reality's underlying structure that went beyond anything achieved by later civilizations, even those as accomplished as the ancient Shaker. The recall function proved perhaps the most mysterious of all the new abilities, for it involved manipulation of time itself in ways that seemed to violate every principle that governed cause and effect. Objects could be restored to previous states regardless of the processes that had changed them, suggesting mastery over temporal forces that approached the domain of the gods themselves. The Ultra Hand capability that allowed Link to manipulate objects from a distance through force of will alone demonstrated how Zonai technology could extend the reach of consciousness beyond the normal boundaries of physical form. This power transformed the entire relationship between mind and matter, allowing thought itself to become a tool for reshaping reality according to the user's intentions and understanding. As Link learned to integrate these new abilities with the skills he had developed during his previous adventures, he began to understand that the Zonai had achieved something that no later civilization had managed to replicate. They had found ways to enhance mortal capabilities without corrupting the essential nature of those who used their technologies. Their constructs did not dominate or replace human agency, but rather amplified and refined it, creating partnerships between consciousness and capability that brought out the best in both. The exploration of the floating islands, and the ancient ruins they contained revealed a civilization that had achieved remarkable harmony between different aspects of existence that later ages had often seen as fundamentally opposed. The Zonai had apparently found ways to unite the practical with the mystical, the innovative with the traditional, the individual with the collective in ways that created strength without sacrificing flexibility or wisdom without compromising effectiveness. Their understanding of the three fundamental virtues that the Triforce represented seemed to have been more sophisticated than anything achieved by subsequent cultures, for they had apparently recognized that power, wisdom, and courage were not separate qualities to be balanced against each other, but different aspects of a single underlying reality that could be expressed in countless ways. Their society had apparently been built upon principles that acknowledged the unity beneath apparent diversity, the connections that bound all existence together in webs of mutual dependence and shared purpose. The dragon forms that appeared in Hyrule's skies during this period of transformation carried within their massive bodies secrets that connected the present crisis with events that had transpired in ages so remote that they existed at the very dawn of recorded history. These ancient beings were not merely powerful creatures, but living repositories of knowledge and experience that spanned geological ages, witnesses to transformations and conflicts that had shaped the fundamental nature of reality itself. The light dragon that soared among them carried within its luminous form the essence of Princess Zelda herself, transformed by contact with forces that operated beyond normal mortal comprehension. Her sacrifice to provide Link with the Master Sword, enhanced by temporal power, represented the same kind of selfless dedication that had characterized her century-long battle with Calamity Ganon. Yet it also opened possibilities for healing and restoration that transcended anything that conventional understanding might have suggested was possible. The relationship between past and future, between cause and effect, between intention and outcome, became fluid during this period of cosmic transformation, as the boundaries that normally separated different aspects of existence began to blur and interpenetrate in ways that created new possibilities, while also revealing connections that had always existed but had been hidden from ordinary perception. Link's quest to gather the scattered fragments of regional phenomena and restore balance to the transformed landscape took him to locations where the normal rules of physics and metaphysics had been suspended or altered by forces that operated according to principles that transcended mortal understanding. Each temple he explored, each puzzle he solved, each alliance he forged with beings whose nature extended beyond conventional categories, contributed to his growing understanding of how individual actions could influence cosmic patterns. The sages who aided him in this work were not merely powerful individuals, but representatives of fundamental principles that govern the relationship between order and chaos, stability and change, preservation and transformation. Their combined efforts to address the regional disturbances created by the upheaval demonstrated how cooperation between different forms of wisdom and capability could achieve results that exceeded what any individual could accomplish alone. The final confrontation with Ganondorf, in his fully awakened state, represented not just a battle between good and evil, but a collision between different visions of what reality should become and how power should be used to shape the future. The ancient king's accumulated malice had transformed him into something that transcended normal categories of existence, a being whose very presence was an affront to the natural order, and whose ambitions threatened to unravel the fabric of creation itself. The battle that raged across multiple dimensions simultaneously tested every aspect of Link's growth and development, requiring him to draw upon not just the skills he had mastered, but the wisdom he had gained about the proper relationship between individual will and cosmic purpose. The abilities granted by his Zonai construct were not sufficient by themselves. They needed to be guided by understanding that went beyond mere technical competence to encompass moral clarity about what was worth fighting for and what principles were worth any sacrifice to preserve. Princess Zelda's eventual restoration from her dragon form represented a triumph of hope over despair, of love over hatred, of the fundamental unity that bound all existence together over the forces that sought to tear such unity apart. The miracle of her return to mortal form, while retaining the wisdom gained through her transformation, demonstrated that sacrifice made in service of others could create possibilities that transcended the apparent limitations of natural law. The Hyrule that emerged from this cosmic upheaval was neither the kingdom that had existed before Calamity Ganon's return, nor the world that had developed during the century of Princess Zelda's imprisonment, but something entirely new that incorporated lessons learned from both triumph and tragedy, wisdom gained through both victory and defeat. The floating islands that remained in the sky served as permanent reminders that reality was far more flexible and full of possibility than most had ever imagined. The Zonai technologies that had been revealed during the crisis became tools for ongoing exploration and development, rather than mere weapons for fighting ancient evils, opening up new possibilities for transportation, construction, and creative expression that would influence the kingdom's development for generations to come. The constructs and devices that Link had learned to create and operate represented not just practical solutions to immediate problems, but new ways of thinking about the relationship between intention and capability, between individual creativity and collective benefit. The bonds that had been forged between Link and Princess Zelda through their shared trials and mutual sacrifice became the foundation for a new kind of leadership that combined the best aspects of traditional authority with innovative approaches to governance and social organization. Their partnership demonstrated how different forms of strength and wisdom could complement each other without either dominating or being subsumed by the other. The sages who had aided in addressing the regional phenomena became ongoing collaborators in the work of building a society that could accommodate both stability and growth, both respect for tradition and openness to change. Their continued cooperation represented a new model for how different communities and cultures could work together while maintaining their distinctive characteristics and contributions to the larger whole. The memory of Ganondorf's final defeat served not as cause for complacency, but as reminder of the eternal vigilance required to preserve freedom and justice against forces that would corrupt or destroy them. The knowledge that evil could take new forms and find new opportunities meant that each generation would need to develop its own understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than individual desire, while also respecting the dignity and autonomy of every conscious being. The Triforce itself, though never appearing in its familiar triangular form during this crisis, had been present throughout in ways that shaped events according to principles that transcended immediate appearances or temporary setbacks. The three virtues it represented had found expression through the choices made by individuals who might never have realized they were serving cosmic purposes, demonstrating that divine influence operated through moral clarity and courageous action rather than through supernatural intervention that bypassed the need for human agency and responsibility. The future that stretched ahead carried within it both promise and peril, both opportunities for growth and development that exceeded anything previously imagined, and challenges that would test whether the lessons learned through struggle and sacrifice would prove sufficient to guide wise choices in circumstances that could not be anticipated. The upheaval had revealed that reality was far stranger and more wonderful than most had ever suspected, but it had also demonstrated that such wonder came with responsibilities that extended beyond any single individual or generation. The Kingdom of Hyrule stood at the beginning of a new age, equipped with tools and knowledge that opened possibilities for achievement, that transcended the limitations that had once seemed absolute, yet also aware that such possibilities could be realized only through continued dedication to the principles of wisdom, power, and courage that had guided heroes and sages throughout all the ages of conflict and triumph that had shaped the eternal dance between light and darkness, hope and despair, creation and destruction that defined the very nature of existence itself. In the fullness of time, when the immediate crises had been resolved, and the urgent battles fought and won, when heroes had claimed their victories and kingdoms had been restored to peace, there came a period of profound contemplation that invited deeper understanding of the eternal mysteries that had shaped every moment of the great drama that had unfolded across the ages. This was the time for stepping back from the specific events and particular conflicts to perceive the larger patterns that connected all things, to recognize the fundamental truths that remained constant beneath the ever-changing surface of mortal experience. The Triforce, that sacred relic which had been present in some form throughout every chapter of Hyrule's history, revealed itself to be something far more profound and encompassing than any single artifact could ever be, no matter how powerful or how divinely crafted. The golden triangles that had appeared in various configurations across the centuries were not the true Triforce, but merely its most visible and comprehensible manifestations, symbols that mortal minds could grasp, of realities that transcended all normal categories of understanding. The deeper truth was that the Triforce existed as the fundamental organizing principle of reality itself, the underlying structure that gave meaning and coherence to all existence. It was not something that could be possessed or controlled, not an object that could be claimed by those who proved themselves worthy, but rather the essential nature of being itself made manifest in forms that consciousness could perceive and interact with. Power, wisdom, and courage were not merely virtues to be cultivated or abilities to be developed, but the three basic aspects of existence that every conscious being participated in simply by virtue of being alive. Every choice made and every action taken expressed some combination of these fundamental forces. Whether the individual making those choices understood their cosmic significance or remained entirely unaware of the deeper patterns their decisions helped to weave. The cycles of conflict and resolution, struggle and triumph, darkness and light that had characterized Hyrule's history were not random sequences of unrelated events, but expressions of deeper rhythms that governed the relationship between creation and destruction, order and chaos, stability and change. These patterns repeated across different scales and different time frames, from the cosmic cycles that measured the rise and fall of civilizations, to the intimate personal struggles that defined individual lives. The heroes who had emerged in each age to face the challenges of their time were not unique individuals chosen by arbitrary divine preference, but manifestations of heroic consciousness that arose naturally whenever circumstances required someone to stand for principles that transcended personal comfort and safety. The spirit of the hero was not bound to any particular person or bloodline, but represented a potential that existed within every conscious being, waiting to be awakened by situations that demanded courage in service of something greater than individual survival or success. Link, in his various incarnations across the different timelines and ages, embodied not just personal courage but the universal principle of action taken in defense of others, of individual will aligned with cosmic purpose, of mortal determination that refused to accept that evil could triumph permanently over good. His recurring presence in times of crisis demonstrated that heroism was not an accident or anomaly, but an essential aspect of reality's fundamental structure. Princess Zelda, throughout her many lifetimes and transformations, represented not just wisdom preserved and transmitted across generations, but the principle of consciousness that could perceive connections and patterns that transcended immediate appearances. Her struggles to awaken and control her inherited powers reflected the universal challenge of learning to use knowledge and ability responsibly, of discovering how individual gifts could serve purposes larger than personal ambition or desire. Ganondorf, in his various manifestations as destroyer and corrupter, embodied not just personal evil, but the necessary principle of opposition that gave meaning to choice, the darkness against which light could define itself, the destructive force that made creation meaningful by providing alternatives that revealed the true value of what was being protected and preserved. Even his role as ultimate antagonist served essential purposes in the larger pattern of growth and development that characterized conscious evolution. The three fundamental forces that the Triforce represented operated not just in the realm of heroic adventure and cosmic conflict, but in every aspect of ordinary existence, from the most mundane daily activities to the most profound spiritual insights. Every decision about how to treat others reflected the balance between power and compassion. Every attempt to understand complex situations required the integration of wisdom with courage. Every effort to create something new demanded the harmonious cooperation of all three principles. The splitting of the Triforce that had occurred in various ages when individuals proved unworthy of wielding its complete power was not a failure or flaw in the system, but an essential mechanism for ensuring that such tremendous capability would be distributed rather than concentrated, shared rather than hoarded, developed through cooperation rather than claimed through domination. The separation forced different individuals to develop different aspects of the complete truth, creating situations where wholeness could be achieved only through unity and mutual support. The kingdoms and civilizations that had risen and fallen throughout Hyrule's history demonstrated how collective expressions of the three principles could create golden ages of prosperity and harmony, or dark periods of suffering and conflict, depending upon whether the societies involved understood and honored the proper relationships between power, wisdom, and courage. The most successful civilizations had been those that recognized the need for all three virtues to work together, while the most destructive had been those that elevated one principle above the others. The ancient Sheikah represented perhaps the clearest example of what could be achieved when technological innovation was guided by spiritual wisdom and motivated by genuine desire to serve others rather than to dominate them. Their achievements transcended mere mechanical cleverness because they understood that true progress required not just the ability to manipulate physical forces, but the moral clarity to use such abilities in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the dignity and freedom of conscious beings. The various races of Hyrule each contributed their own understanding of how the fundamental principles could be expressed through different cultural forms and different approaches to living. The Gorons embodied power, expressed through protection and generosity rather than conquest and exploitation. The Zora demonstrated wisdom manifested through patience and careful observation rather than abstract theorizing divorced from practical experience. The Rito showed how courage could be channeled through exploration and communication rather than merely through combat and confrontation. The Gerudo provided perhaps the most complex example of how the three principles could be both honored and distorted within the same cultural framework. Their warrior traditions cultivated genuine courage, and their leadership structures required real wisdom, yet their isolation and their focus on strength sometimes led them toward expressions of power that emphasized domination rather than service. The recurring appearance of Ganondorf within their society reflected both their potential for greatness and their vulnerability to corruption when strength became separated from compassion. The Hylians served as the binding element that held the diverse expressions of the kingdom together, their natural adaptability and diplomatic instincts, making them ideal mediators between different approaches to understanding and expressing the fundamental truths. Yet their very flexibility sometimes made them vulnerable to losing sight of the deeper principles that should guide such mediation, leading to periods when political expedience took precedence over moral clarity. The timeline splits that had resulted from the Hero of Time's victory and Princess Zelda's compassionate decision to heal the wounds in his soul demonstrated how reality itself was flexible enough to accommodate multiple expressions of the same underlying truths. Each timeline developed its own understanding of how heroism could manifest, its own solutions to the eternal challenges of balancing individual freedom with collective responsibility, its own ways of maintaining the harmony between power, wisdom, and courage that made civilization possible. The Fallen Hero timeline showed how even the most devastating defeats could become opportunities for deeper understanding and more profound redemption. The corruption of the sacred realm into the dark world created circumstances that demanded new forms of courage and new expressions of wisdom, ultimately leading to victories that might not have been possible if the original conflicts had been resolved more easily. The child timeline demonstrated how preventing tragedies before they occurred could create their own unique challenges and opportunities. The early defeat of Ganondorf prevented certain forms of suffering but also eliminated certain opportunities for growth and development, leading to different threats that required different forms of heroism and different expressions of the eternal principles. The adult timeline revealed how the most complete victories could carry within them the seeds of future challenges that transcended the original conflicts. The flooding of Hyrule eliminated certain threats, but also forced survivors to develop new understandings of what it meant to preserve tradition while adapting to radically changed circumstances. The convergence of these timelines in the era of the Wild represented not just a return to unity, but a synthesis that incorporated lessons learned through all the different expressions of possibility. The heroes and sages of this age inherited not just the achievements of their predecessors, but the wisdom gained through exploring multiple paths toward the same fundamental goals. The Zonai civilization that was revealed during the upheaval provided glimpses of what might be possible when the three principles achieved perfect harmony across an entire society. Their technologies operated according to principles that bridged the gap between the physical and the spiritual, between individual creativity and collective benefit, between innovation and tradition in ways that suggested possibilities for development that later ages had barely begun to imagine. The secret teachings that had been preserved in the most ancient texts spoke of a time when the boundaries between mortal and divine, between individual and cosmic, between finite and infinite, would become transparent to consciousness that had learned to perceive reality as it truly was, rather than as it appeared to limited perception. The Triforce represented not just power that could be wielded, but understanding that could be achieved, not just abilities that could be developed, but states of being that could be realized. The meditation practices that had been developed by the sages and spiritual teachers throughout the ages were designed to help practitioners recognize their own participation in the cosmic patterns that the Triforce represented. Through disciplined attention to the workings of their own consciousness, individuals could learn to perceive directly how power, wisdom, and courage operated within their own experience, how their choices contributed to the larger patterns of harmony or discord that shaped collective reality. The prayers and rituals that had been performed at the sacred springs and temples across the centuries were not mere superstitions or empty ceremonies, but practical methods for aligning individual will with cosmic purpose, for opening consciousness to influences that could guide decision-making toward outcomes that served the greater good rather than narrow self-interest. The effectiveness of such practices depended not on blind faith, but on the quality of attention and intention that practitioners brought to their spiritual work. The symbols and sacred geometries that appeared throughout Hyrule's art and architecture encoded information about the fundamental relationships that governed all existence. The triangular forms that represented the Triforce were not arbitrary designs, but mathematical expressions of how unity could manifest as multiplicity without losing its essential coherence. How different aspects of truth could maintain their distinctiveness while contributing to larger patterns of meaning and purpose. The music and poetry that had been created to celebrate and transmit the wisdom of the ages operated according to harmonic principles that reflected the same relationships that governed the balance between power, wisdom, and courage. The songs that could open doors and solve puzzles were not magical in any supernatural sense, but were expressions of understanding about how different frequencies of consciousness could resonate with different aspects of reality to produce desired effects. The foods and medicines that had been developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation demonstrated how even the most practical activities could be informed by awareness of deeper principles. The elixirs that could enhance strength or endurance or perception worked by supporting the natural processes through which consciousness expressed itself in physical form, helping to align material and spiritual aspects of existence in ways that promoted health and effectiveness. The relationships between different individuals and communities that had been forged through shared struggles and mutual support created networks of connection that transcended physical proximity or cultural similarity. The bonds that united the champions across different eras, the alliances that held together diverse peoples during times of crisis, the love that could awaken dormant powers and heal seemingly incurable wounds, all reflected the fundamental truth that separation was ultimately an illusion that could be transcended through recognition of underlying unity. The prophecies and ancient predictions that had guided heroes and rulers throughout the ages were not supernatural revelations imposed from outside, but expressions of deep understanding about how current choices would inevitably lead to future consequences. The seers and prophets who had preserved such wisdom possessed not magical abilities to peer into predetermined futures, but practical knowledge about how the principles of cause and effect operated across extended time periods and complex circumstances. The ultimate teaching that emerged from contemplation of all these patterns and relationships was that the Triforce had never been separate from those who sought it, that the power, wisdom, and courage it represented were not external gifts to be earned, but inherent aspects of consciousness itself that needed only to be recognized and developed. The sacred relic served not as the source of these qualities, but as a mirror that reflected back to seekers the potential that had always existed within their own nature. The various trials and challenges that heroes had faced throughout the ages were not arbitrary obstacles designed to test worthiness, but practical exercises that helped develop the understanding and capability necessary to use power responsibly. Each puzzle solved and each enemy defeated contributed to the growth of consciousness that could perceive larger patterns and make choices that served purposes beyond immediate personal benefit. The transformation that occurred when individuals finally achieved perfect balance between the three principles was not a change in their fundamental nature, but a recognition of what had always been true, a awakening to realities that had been present but unrecognized throughout their previous experience. The golden light that manifested at such moments was not energy imposed from outside, but the natural radiance of consciousness that had learned to perceive and express its own deepest truth. The eternal cycle that brought heroes and villains, conflicts and resolutions, darkness and light in endless succession was not a trap or punishment, but an opportunity for continued growth and development that could never reach final completion, because the possibilities for deeper understanding and more complete expression were themselves infinite. Each turn of the wheel brought new opportunities to explore uncharted territories of wisdom and compassion, new chances to discover what remained to be learned about the proper use of power and the courageous expression of love. The Triforce itself, in its deepest essence, was revealed to be nothing more or less than the eternal invitation to become what one was always meant to be, the constant possibility of transcending current limitations while honoring the value of what had already been achieved. It was the promise that no matter how dark circumstances might become or how impossible challenges might appear, the potential for redemption and transformation remained always present, waiting only for the recognition that would allow its infinite creativity to manifest in forms that served the highest good of all existence. And so our journey through the golden threads of destiny draws to its peaceful close, like the gentle setting of the sun over Hyrule's eternal fields. We have witnessed the Triforce through countless ages, seen it guide heroes and challenge kingdoms, watched it split and reunify like the very cycle of breathing that now carries you toward rest. The sacred relic continues its work even now, weaving through dreams and memories, binding together all the stories yet to be told. Perhaps in your own dreams tonight, you will walk through the sacred realm where golden light dances on crystal walls, or soar above skyloft where ancient wisdom still whispers on the wind. Rest now in the knowledge that courage, wisdom, and power live within every heart, waiting to be awakened when they are needed most. The Triforce's greatest secret is not its ability to grant wishes, but its reminder that we each carry these virtues within ourselves, ready to shine like golden light against any darkness we may face. Sleep well, gentle dreamer, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet magic that flows through all things, connecting every soul in an eternal dance of hope, wonder, and peaceful rest.